Good afternoon, everybody. It's December 5th, and this is a meeting of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. Our first agenda item is to just review the agenda, and then we'll get to approving our minutes from our last meeting. And then our facilitator and co-chair Rich Cowart should be joining shortly. So the agenda was circulated in advance. We've allocated roughly 45 minutes to an hour for each of our three sectoral task groups to present on the priority actions that they've identified in their work throughout the summer and fall. Have some discussion with the rest of the subcommittee, solicit input and understanding of those priorities, and also work in some equity considerations into those priorities. We'll be pausing for public comment kind of after each sector does its presentation so that we can get that feedback as we go rather than waiting till the end. And then at the end, we're going to close down with consolidating and making sure we have agreement on the roughly 10 to 15 priority actions that have been requested by the council from each subcommittee. Have a final round of public comment before we close, and then talk about our next steps. Just as a reminder in terms of timeline, I think everybody knows this, but the Climate Council is meeting on December 16th, and we'll be considering these priority actions that have been delivered by each subcommittee. And we have one more meeting prior to that December 16th meeting, which would be a week from today. And we can talk about plans for that meeting as well before we close out. Here, it looks like David is joining now.
Folks.
So agenda item, hi, David, I'm still on the agenda, and I am thinking Rich will be joining any second. So our first action item is to approve the minutes from the November 14th meeting. Those were linked in the agenda. Are there any comments or edits to the minutes? And again, thank you to Christine for preparing those.
Just, sorry, coming on video, just one suggested revision. This may apply to other people as well, but at the beginning in the attendees list, there are kind of organizational affiliations. I know for me, I participate in the Climate Council as an appointed counselor, not on behalf of or representing the organization that I work for separately. So to the extent that there are going to be affiliations, mine should just say Climate Counselor. Others may have the same situation, but I'm not representing the organization I work for in my attendance here.
Okay, I don't know that we need to spend a ton of time on that now. Maybe it's something to talk about at the council level, because counselors are appointed due to an affiliation, right? So
not due to an affiliation with an organization or business, it's because of their experience or expertise. So I'm appointed to provide expertise in energy data and analysis, not to represent EAN. And it's an important distinction.
Don't need to split hairs on it now, but I would flag that your seat is an organization that has expertise in data and analysis. So I think the affiliation is appropriate, but I don't need to be the last word on this. Just think it's probably a council decision. And providing that affiliation seems helpful to understand the where folks are coming from.
Okay. Why don't we work on that later in the steering committee or something?
Any other comments or edits to the notes? Do we want to table approval until we get some clarity on this affiliation question?
I would encourage you to approve the notes and also make a note that there's a request to handle affiliation differently. Yeah.
Okay. Motion to approve the minutes. It looks like we got one from Matt and Christine. Any objections to the minutes? Great. We'll deem those approved. Sorry, I'm getting a text from Rich Cowart that he's having trouble joining, so we'll work through those technical difficulties. Any other updates you wanted to share, David, to set the stage before we just jump in to the meat of the agenda?
I mean, I'm not quite sure what's been shared so far, but I will say that today we really want to lean in to talking about priority actions, and we're going to really try to focus in, not spend a ton of time on the full list, but to spend as much time as we can on looking at priority actions and how that looks when we look across transportations, buildings, electricity, and anything else. And so that's our big goal today, is to get to a place where we feel like we've had a good conversation and we're closing in on, if not agreeing on, those priority actions. And happy to help everyone as we go through and sort of what it means to be in action, and what level of detail that requires.
Great, thank you. And so next up, we just have kind of a reminder of the task and an understanding of the GHG reductions and projections going forward. Jared, you're on here for that. Are you teed up to deliver that discussion?
Yes, just give me 1 second.
Can we just clarify who's taking the minutes, please?
Oh, apologies, Christine. David, do you have anyone lined up from CBI to take minutes?
I'm happy to take some notes if you want me to be taking the notes.
Please. Sorry, I couldn't get on. Now I'm here. Happy to be with you.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I'm happy to take notes and turn those into some minutes. That's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Welcome, everybody. Really glad you're here. I'm sure Melissa's already welcomed you. Before we get going, we thought it would be a good idea just to set the stage for the work that we are focused on. And I guess I'd like to start by just saying two things. The first is, with this group, I don't need to elaborate very much, but would observe that since we began our work together, the climate crisis has only gotten worse, and the need for action globally has only become more obvious and more urgent. And so we have an important task to do. The Global Warming Solutions Act sets out that task for us. And Jared, maybe you could just put the words on the screen.
Yeah, let me share.
That it's just a reminder as we begin our work, what we're trying to do in developing the plan. You all have read this many times, I suppose, so I'm not going to repeat everything, but we have a serious challenge both to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act emission reduction requirements and to promote resilience and prepare the state's communities to adapt to climate change. And if you would go to the next slide, Jared, our committee in particular needs to focus on the strategies and programs that would result in the largest possible greenhouse gas emissions in the most cost-effective manner. And I guess, you know, when we think about this, we also need to keep top of mind the high priority to do all of this in ways that are equitable and inclusive. And I just wanted to set the stage by beginning with a reminder of the context in which we're doing this work. And the second part of the context is like, where are we on the numbers? And, you know, what are the most important sectors for emissions, and how are we doing? And I've asked Jared to give us a short intro on that.
Thanks, Rich. So this won't be new to many folks, but is good grounding. As of the latest greenhouse gas inventory compiled and published by the Agency of Natural Resources, this is the sectoral breakdown from statewide emissions in 2021, with by far the two largest climate polluting sectors in our state being fossil fuels used for transportation and the heating of buildings in Vermont. The transportation and thermal sectors, 70% of statewide greenhouse gas emissions. This is a graph that looks at emissions by sector over time, starting in the baseline year of 2005, which is the baseline that the Paris Climate Agreement uses and that the Global Warming Solutions Act uses for the first legal obligation around greenhouse gas emissions reduction. There's some interesting trends to look at here. If you look at the three energy sectors that we will be focusing the bulk of our meeting on today in terms of recommendations, you see that there's differential progress in reducing emissions. The electricity sector has seen emissions decline by 2/3 since 2005 and is already below the sectoral target for 2025, which you can see in this black dashed line here in the blue. We've made significant reductions in transportation emissions since 2005 as of 2021, above the 2025 sectoral target for transportation. But that is a positive trend, at least up until we saw a recent rebound post-COVID. The one energy sector that has made the least progress in reducing emissions is in the thermal sector, where we've only seen an 8% reduction in climate pollution since 2005. But I thought that would be a helpful kind of breakdown by sector individually to be able to see it that way. This graph looks at, in the bolder colors on the left, the historical emissions, transportation in green, thermal in orange, and looks at, with these three blue dots, the key obligation years or dates of by January 1st, 2025, January 1, 2030, January 1, 2050, where the Solutions Act obligates statewide emissions to be reduced to versus where they've been historically. This shaded portion assumes proportional sectoral reductions in getting towards those statewide emissions reduction targets. And then this is the last slide for context, focusing in on that thermal sector, which has been where the emissions reductions have proven most difficult to achieve. In the first climate action plan, there was a pathways analysis that set targets for key actions, key solutions in reducing emissions in the thermal sector, including weatherization, heat pump water heaters, and heat pumps. And these are screenshots from EAN's energy dashboard, utilizing statewide data from our efficiency and other utilities, looking at how many comprehensive weatherization projects have happened, heat pump water heaters installed, cold climate heat pumps installed. And we can see that as of 2023, none of those key pathways for action are more than much more than a third of the way towards the targets we had set to be in line towards the 2030 target. A caveat here that this analysis will need to be updated. This is from the first plan, but as a starting reference point in terms of how far along the way are we in terms of some of these key actions, there is some important progress being made, but not yet at the scale and pace that would have us on target for our 2030 obligations. So I think that's probably it for now, unless folks have questions, but hopefully that was a helpful starting point for context.
Thanks, Jared.
Jared, thank you. David, back to you.
Great. Yeah. And so that was a sort of grounding of the task. And what we'd love to do now is go in by task group, and for each of the three task groups, spend a little time having task groups lift up their priority actions. And you want to give us a quick spread of everything as well, fine, but we're looking for a very tight presentation around priority actions. and the sweep of things you're working on. And then we want to have some time for discussion, and we're actually leaving a little time for public comment after each of the 3 task groups. I will say one of the things we want to lean into today is the question of equity and how these types of actions, these priority actions, will be felt by a variety of Vermonters, including low-income Vermonters and others. And so we want to spend some time on that today, because you as a subgroup or subcommittee are going to want to have a narrative that accompanies these priority actions that says, this is how we've been thinking about a just transition and the issues of equity. And we have some guidance from the Just Transition Subcommittee. You'll remember that, about specific questions. We can pull those up if we need them. Okay, that's it. I would say let's dive into buildings and thermal first. And so I'll turn it over to that task group. I can't even remember. I think, Melissa, you might have even been voluntold to offer up this initial presentation with the help from other folks on that task group. So let me turn it over to Melissa or whoever is going to be leading us in this initial presentation.
Yep, Dave's going to kick us off and then pass the baton.
Okay,
It's a
great.
a team effort. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. What we plan to do is provide a quick view of our pathways, strategies, and actions, a really quick look. So you get a sense of where we're boiling down things and making more narrow recommendations. We're going to focus on those priorities, and then we look forward to having a discussion with you all. And we want your input, we want your reactions, and we welcome those and your questions as well. So it's important to understand that we don't have the time to go into great detail. We've narrowed things down for this presentation, which makes sense, and we have prioritizing for purposes of this presentation. But I think it's really important to understand this. Even some of the terminology we're going to use quickly could use more time. Our group has gone into a great deal of effort to vet and to explore these proposals. For instance, if you consider, we use the term beneficial electrification. It's not just electrification. For it to be beneficial, it has to benefit consumers directly, avoid greenhouse gas emissions, and it has to be employed wherever possible by utilities to maximize the use of their existing grid resources before new investment is required. So the question is, how many EVs are being managed? That implicates beneficial electrification. How many water heaters are being managed? Does the same thing. So the point is here, just because we don't go into huge detail or even make some specific recommendations today, I think it's important to recognize that all these approaches that I'm going to run through really quickly, we've thought about impact and cost effectiveness, co-benefits, equity, and technical feasibility before even listing them. That's been really important to our work group's discussion. So let me run through these really quickly so you get a sense of the things that we're going to recommend, where those come from. Pathway 1 is reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with an overarching market-based policy framework. And under this pathway, we have a strategy and several actions. Under Pathway 2, we're looking at weatherization, efficiency improvements in buildings, and electric codes and energy and electric codes and standards. 4 strategies, 13 actions developed. Pathway 3, we're looking at thermal equipment and greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. And we've developed 3 strategies and 3 actions under that pathway. The next pathway, number 4, we're looking at beneficial electrification and focusing on the equitable access to cost-effective and affordable opportunities by low and moderate income households to those resources. 3 strategies, 4 actions. Pathway 5, reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with the intensity, with greenhouse gas intensity in fuels. 1 strategy, 2 actions there. Pathway 6, optimize greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements and energy equity in public utility regulation related to electricity, gas, and energy efficiency. A strategy and an action there. And finally, this is a cross-cutting pathway, but we've been working on focusing on workforce enablement and supporting businesses to further support workforce. One strategy and pathway there. So, shifting gears, I'm going to be providing the first of these priority recommendations. Going back to pathway 1, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from RCI fuel sectors via an overarching market-based policy. Our first strategy here is to adopt at least one market-based mechanism to reduce thermal sector greenhouse gas emissions, and recognizing that complementary policies are critical. I'm going to come back to complementary policies in a minute because these should be joined at the hip, these two concepts. But basically what we're talking about is a modified clean heat standard. It would be designed for gradual implementation, and that of course puts you in a zero-sum game because what that implies is that you're going to have to get proportional reductions from other complementary policies. So gradual implementation, a cost cap should be part of that, and we want to see a starting price, an actual price laid down. That would be the first action. An alternative to that would be joining a cap and invest program, WCI or NICI, the New York program that's being looked at for purposes of transportation emissions primarily. I understand that's going on now. That's another possibility. So anyway, these two overarching strategies we think are really important because they're going to connect to Global Warming Solutions Act goals, and they're going to serve as an umbrella, so to speak, for complementary policies. Now, let me talk really quickly about complementary policies before I hand it off to Melissa. This is really well-plowed ground, okay? Cap and trade programs have been around for, a decade and a half. Federal state legislations recognize the importance of complementary policies. In Waxman-Markey in 2008, McCain-Lieberman, 2008, Obama's Clean Power Plan, 2015. The last 15 years of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and WCI have all recognized the importance of complementary policies. That's where the rubber hits the road. The price alone is not going to get the work done in this case. They're critical because a comprehensive program is going to combine, an emissions performance standard or an emissions cap with these targeted policies that actually deliver the emissions reductions at the lowest cost to consumers. And when you measure that as cost per ton of avoided greenhouse gas emissions, that's where you're able to determine what those programs, what those complementary policies are doing. And so it's really important, we think, and the further discussion that the other recommendations that my colleagues are going to provide are these complementary policies that are important and will really, in many respects, get the job done. So the following recommendations explore that a little bit more. And I think the microphone's yours, Melissa.
Great, thanks, Dave. There we go. So thank you. For the thermal sector, beyond the comprehensive policy that's being recommended, our recommendations are organized essentially as those applying to buildings, equipment, and fuels. And I'm going to speak to you about buildings. With regard to the building stock in Vermont, there's a need to reduce emissions both from existing structures as well as minimize future emissions from buildings that will be constructed in the future. So you see those two reflected in the second and third bullets here. For existing buildings, essentially, how do we improve the efficiency of the housing stock and the commercial and industrial and municipal buildings we have in Vermont through comprehensive weatherization? And for new construction, how do we continue to strengthen building codes and improve compliance with those codes? We have two specific call outs under this pathway for strategies specific to mobile homes, recognizing that that's been a hard to reach segment. And more than 20,000 households in Vermont do occupy mobile homes, and some of the strategies for stick-built homes are not appropriate for use in mobile homes. And similarly, we have a specific strategy related to rental properties and how do we incentivize efficiency improvements in that housing stock as well, which is similar to mobile homes, been hard to serve and hard to reach. And of course, we are aware that the demographics of folks who live in rental properties as well as mobile homes tend to be lower income Vermonters. So, and
Melissa, can I ask you a quick question? Are all four of these bullets something you're lifting up as priority actions? Or are you giving a flavor of the full range that's in here?
Thank you, David. Yes, these are not our priority actions. That's my next slide. So this is kind of the flavor of how are we addressing buildings writ large, and great segue into our priority action.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And I'll just note that I think one area, of tension that the task group has been talking through is kind of what is the balance of requirements and mandates versus programs and incentives to help encourage folks to make the decisions that we want them to make. And so welcome, broader subcommittee input on that in particular, on that approach question. But the priority action that we're elevating for consideration related to buildings for the Climate Council is promoting weatherization across primarily residential, but also, again, municipal, commercial, and industrial buildings. This is a consensus recommendation coming out of the task group. As we've spoken at length about, weatherization has dual benefits of greenhouse gas reduction, energy use reduction, as well as enhancing affordability at the household level. So it's something that impacts people's pocketbooks. So the recommendation here is to secure the funding needed to achieve comprehensive weatherization, essentially at the scale and pace necessary to meet our GWSA requirements. We're previously, I think there was a specific number of households. We're still refining that based on the modeling that's going to be happening in the Climate Action Plan update. We do have a statutory goal of weatherizing 120,000 homes, and I believe to date we've hit about 40,000. So there's substantial work to be done on improving the fitness of the existing housing stock in Vermont. And in terms of the rationale for selecting this as a priority, again, there's the affordability and equity components, and also just the recognition that if we're looking at impact from improving existing homes, we have a lot more existing homes than new construction coming online currently. The recommendation that we're looking at regarding funding is potentially an increase to the fuel gross receipts tax, which currently does support the low-income weatherization program in Vermont. And we, are continuing to talk through the implications of different funding recommendations, need further consideration there. The group has agreed is in alignment that we don't want to push these additional costs onto the electric sector, which is where many of our efficiency efforts have previously been funded. So looking for a funding source outside of the electric sector to get fossil fuel reductions associated with the building stock in Vermont. And of course, we're wrestling with the tension between sending a price signal that fossil fuels should potentially be more expensive as we want people to transition away from them, while also acknowledging that we don't want those who can't convert to electricity or have not yet converted to electricity to be unduly financially burdened by higher costs. So that's the quick and dirty on buildings, and I think I'm passing it off to Jared to talk about equipment.
Thanks, Melissa. So we've gone from the overarching pathway, which would be kind of underpinning and it's supportive of all of these pathways, to the specific pathway Melissa focused on in terms of buildings, to now focusing on the equipment in those buildings. And the basic idea here is that in the thermal sector, heating equipment tends to have very long lifespans, 15, 20, 25 years. And the goal here is the simple phrase, when you're in a hole, stop digging. And that hole being high pollution and high cost for Vermonters from fossil-based heating equipment. And so what we're looking at here is borrowing from what is happening in other states, including California and Maryland and many other Northeastern and New England states, are looking at this to say, when it comes to newly installed equipment, phasing in a requirement that newly installed equipment meet either a zero greenhouse gas emissions standard or a zero NOx emissions standard. So that is the priority action that we are looking at. There are some really important considerations around the timeline of the phase-in of those standards to avoid lock-in of high pollution, high cost equipment. And there's also some important considerations around exemptions that should be available in circumstances that are more difficult to apply those standards to. But I can go through the strategies, but that is the overall priority action is reducing greenhouse gas emissions by avoiding locking in more fossil equipment, by establishing emissions-based performance standards for newly installed heating equipment at dates, phased in at dates in the future with appropriate exemptions. There is also, within this pathway, another strategy that we think is important. We didn't lift it up as one of the 4 top priority actions, but the third bullet point there is around a performance-based approach to reduce the use or to result in lower global warming potential refrigerants and heat pumps sold in Vermont. I think that's it for that slide.
Thanks. And this slide would be the sort of actual one you would lift up. Yeah.
All right, so that brings us to the fuels pathway. So obviously, when thinking about decarbonizing the thermal sector, fuels is a critical component of that. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of fossil fuel appliances, across the state of Vermont that use fuel every day. And so how do we basically decarbonize that sector while all these other complementary policies for buildings and equipment are being developed and implemented? So this is critical to do alongside that. So what we have come up and kind of contemplated as a group is the adoption of a performance-based clean fuel standard that would implement, a declining carbon intensity score requirement for fuels, as was contemplated or is contemplated in the Clean Heat Standard, and that gradual implementation mechanism would, it could either be a linear or a step change. That could be up for debate, but we would want that to get us to a point that is as close as possible to GWSA requirement, because fuels, we see as one of the strategies that could be more readily implemented in Vermont. Fuels pathways, when thinking of that, there is an equity component in that because, existing fossil fuel fired appliances are in all homes across Vermont, just about, and don't require substantial, potential upfront cost for like a fuel switching measure would, whereas a fuels could be generally dropped in without much infrastructure changeover. And so if you go to the next slide, Dave, this basically this action that we've suggested, again, would be critical to fit into the overall strategy that we have suggested here today to have this performance-based standard that would get us to a point where the fuels we are burning in our homes and businesses has a greatly reduced carbon intensity score versus what we see now across much of the sector. So this is our priority action for the fuels pathway would be to implement or adopt a performance-based clean fuel standard. And I think that's it. I don't know if there's any closing remarks, Dave, or anything that we had, but I think that was it.
Great. Nice. Okay, so just to recap then, you had a market-based mechanism as your starting priority action 1. You had a weatherization action as a second. You had a equipment performance standard action, and you had a clean fuels standard as the fourth, right? Did I miss one of those? Or that was the four?
Those are the
That's right.
categories, that's right.
Okay. I'm going to be taking some notes as I go. And I think one of the things I want to be able to do is like look across these when we're done. And, one way to do that is through something like this, right? Where I'll take some notes and then we can look at it, or we can look at it in Excel or something where it's all consolidated. And you all can help me get the wording right. This is just me throwing some words on a slide. All right. So we'll be doing this as we go. And it may be helpful. We won't look at the ag and ecosystem, which is the slide above. All right. So one of the things we wanted to do is, as a full subcommittee, so every single subcommittee member here, we'd love to hear some reflections about having these priority 4 actions. Sometime this may be the first time that we're really leaning into the fact of how do we feel about an equipment performance standard? How do we feel about making a recommendation about definitely adopting a market-based system, whether it's a modified clean heat standard or a cap and invest program, right? How are we feeling about that? And I think particularly folks who haven't been in the task group, that you're just sort of sitting with this for the first time, let's have a conversation about it. We have a little bit of time here to sort of say, does this feel like, do these feel like the right 4 things for us to be, really shaking and making a lot of noise about at the top of the report? So let me just pause there, particularly folks who haven't been as involved in the task group, but even those who have, like, is there something you'd want to see or something you'd want to understand better before settling into those 4? Any comments about this?
And David, can you put those 4 back up on the screen?
Happily.
Thank you.
There's, and then there was those 4 that you captured, but was there not 5 pathways? So I'm like, what was left out?
Yeah.
I think the numbering might
sorry.
have been off a little bit.
Okay. Okay.
Pathway 5 was the fuels, and I think it should have been 4. So, but
Okay.
good catch.
Well,
But
there-
to be
there were
clear, we
actually-
do have 7 pathways.
7
Right.
pathways.
We have not
Okay.
picked a priority with
Those are
each.
the priorities.
We tried to limit ourselves to 3 to 5 as at the request. So these are the top 4.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, so they're here. Hopefully you can see them okay. I can make them a little bigger. I'm not going in full screen because I want to be able to adjust them in real time if you think my synthesis is not perfect. Christine?
I just want to say I've been out of the process largely the last 2 months, and I have to say I'm very impressed with the thinning and sorting and prioritization that the task group has achieved in this. And I think I strongly support all 4 of the priority recommendations and sincerely believe they would be transformative for Vermont.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks so much. Other reflections on these? Sam?
Hi, all, Sam Lash. I have been a part of the group, so then I'll be quiet after this. But I just want to reflect also that I think there's a fair amount of consideration in terms of the impact on different populations on these actions and on others. And I do think that in the wording somewhere we should make that clear, because we didn't add it as a separate priority, but I think it is embedded within the longer language of each of these. And so I do just want to highlight that. It would be great to bring that to the fore maybe after this, but to be clear that each one comes with its set of sort of either exceptions or priorities based on who might be disproportionately burdened, and to make sure that doesn't happen.
And Sam, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I think one of the things we can do, even if we have time to do it today, is start to tell that story and then make sure we're capturing it so that it finds its way into the framing of these actions and or the actions themselves. So let's do an initial round. I want to circle back to that as well. Liz?
Liz,
some
we
reason
can't hear
I
you.
can't hear you. I'm not sure why. No, something about your headphones is being squirrely.
How about that?
Much better.
Great. I just took them off. So
There you go.
forget technology. Anyway, this is more of a question than a comment, but hopefully it follows well after Sam's. Appreciating the comment that you all made about the funding source for weatherization being elsewhere than electric in terms of affordability for Vermonters. This is the question, what is the interaction that you're intending from these 4 priorities on the funding? The first is some version of clean heat or cap and invest, either way, raising funds. The 4th is performance-based, but has implications for the cost of fuel. So I guess I don't understand that. How are you thinking about, especially priority 2, with regard to interaction with 1 and 4?
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I jump to Gina, although Gina, I don't know if you've been involved in this conversation, I wonder when we think and look at these 4 together and we think about funding and how that interacts. Jared, did you want to quick jump in on that? Or you have something else?
I was going to offer to respond to Liz's question.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good point about the interaction between 1 and 2, Liz, because certainly revenue that is raised from a cap and invest program, some of that could be invested in additional weatherization. Some of it could also be rebated to lower and middle income Vermonters to hold them harmless. Those have been part of the discussions. I think that, and I would invite others from the task group to comment, my sense, both personally and my sense of the group as a whole, that weatherization was seen as such an important priority with so many multiple benefits, from health benefits to cost-saving benefits to emissions reduction benefits, that it deserved its own dedicated funding source rather than just being one among a list of options that could be funded through a cap and invest program, and not just a dedicated funding source as it exists now, but dedicated increased revenue to invest in weatherization, especially for the homes of low and middle income Vermonters. My understanding of the 4th proposal is that there's an important distinction between a clean fuels standard and a clean heat standard, in that the clean heat standard proposal that was envisioned and that could be part of number 1 as a modified clean heat standard would allow emissions reductions to happen not just on the fuel side, but also with projects like weatherization or on the equipment side, whereas a clean fuel standard would primarily be about moving towards lower carbon intensity fuels, where weatherization likely wouldn't play a role in that program as kind of classically or narrowly designed. I hope that's helpful. I'm also happy to share some broader context at another point, but I think that's the most specific reply that is hopefully helpful to your question.
No, it's super helpful. I just have in mind, building off what Sam said, affordability for Vermonters, right? And so as you consider finalizing these, and as we as a subcommittee consider whether they get sent up to the Climate Council, having more specificity around that discussion, so that, because I think one could fairly read these 4 and not understand the perhaps overlapping and therefore not duplicative or additive costs that could be embedded. And I think it would be a significant concern if, instead of overlapping, it were additive, even more so. So at any rate, just think about that as you continue, and I would suggest we all should.
Thanks, Liz. Dave, and then I want to get to Gina's point.
Thank you. And thanks for this question, Liz. It's important. I wanted to recognize that we generally are thinking about what incremental costs are going to be laid on the shoulders of Vermonters by the things we're doing here. But one of the things that I wanted to emphasize, it sort of goes to the comments that I made about beneficial electrification, is that currently the status quo is putting upward pressure on rates and risks putting upward pressure on rates. And I'm thinking about uncontrolled electrification. Now, GMP, for example, has a remarkably good EV managed charging program. I don't know exactly what the score is, how many of those EVs in GMP's territory are being controlled, but I think it's probably really good. Other utilities don't have that. So if somebody's buying an EV, charging it, they're putting potentially a demand on the distribution system that's going to have to be recovered in investments, new investments that all ratepayers are going to pay for. The same with water heaters, not controlling water heaters. We should be doing those sorts of things. And I just wanted to point out, to avoid upward pressure on rates, we need to consider the status quo as well as these potential incremental efforts that we're talking about here.
Thanks, Dave. Gina?
Yeah, this is more of a process question, and it's going to apply, I know, with transportation, maybe electricity too. These are like baskets of actions. They're generalized, and the devil will be in the details, and we'll get into the equity and how do you pay for it when you define the specifics, the research that's necessary, the data collection that's necessary to do those 4 bullets. So when is that going to happen at the Climate Council level? What we have here, in my view, when we all went through this, we took our actions and we mushed them together into one thing, but they're a basket of actions that some are defined and some are not at this point to get to what these actions say they want to achieve.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm thinking too far ahead and it'll all make sense. But right now I can't envision how that's going to happen. Maybe
I have a thought on this, and I'd welcome others' reactions to this as well. But it seems to me that the purpose of the Climate Council is to provide some clear orientation to legislators and to the administration about the kinds of things that the state should be pursuing. And what's most helpful is orientation and then some level of specificity in that orientation of what to do. I think there's a level of specificity, Gina, about, exact program design and funding that the council should provide orientation, but doesn't need to be the one doing it. The legislature, the administration needs to be the one doing that. So my recommendation is this level of action is probably fine if it's accompanied with some narrative that says our intentions are this. When we think about funding, we think about this, right? And so you're able to provide some additional wraparound to this that gets at some of that sort of intentionality. So when someone's dealing with the details, they get the thinking that you put into it.
that helps. That helps me a little bit.
Yeah, it's still squirrel. I agree. It's like, it's hard. Yeah. Rich?
Well, first, I just want to echo what you just said about what's the role of the Climate Council compared to the role either of the legislature or of executive agencies that are going to design and implement programs. So I completely agree with your framing there. But while I'm speaking, I might as well address what the test group has presented. And I want to say I very much like what they have presented. I think it presents a very good package of priorities for the council to adopt and recommend. And I accept, and I mean, I really agree with the point that will be highly beneficial to have both an overarching strategy of some kind and a set of complementary policies that deliver on that, deliver towards meeting the goals that are set out by that strategy. And, for example, in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, we have an overarching carbon reduction goal for the power sector, but at the same time, we all have renewable portfolio standards, and we have energy efficiency standards, and we have rate design initiatives, and there's a whole raft of complementary policies that make the attainment of the overall goal much more efficient, and where equity concerns need to be loaded in, they can be made more equitable as well, because there's a revenue source, as I think Dave pointed out, that can be targeted in ways to make the policy more equitable as well as more fundamentally effective. I have one comment to make about the phrase market-based mechanisms. I think that it's okay to use that phrase market-based mechanisms, but to realize that what's really going on when we use that phrase is kind of like four things all at once. And I think Dave did a very good job actually of laying this out. But one reason for putting it the way they have put it, it seems to me is, and now I'm echoing something that Liz also said, that so far in our public policy making, we have loaded a lot of the costs and requirements for decarbonization on the power sector. And we've been paying for it in the power sector. And we have not been paying for it in the fuels sector or the fossil sector. And there is a need going forward, as we want to attain greater and greater emission reductions, to make sure that we rebalance the level of effort that's being required from fossil compared with electricity, and particularly recognizing that the electricity is a cleaner source of fuel, and it's where we want to go in the future. That's point number one, is the importance of price rebalancing. The second point is that these overarching mechanisms can provide a degree of certainty that we will stay on track. And that's the benefit of a carbon cap or the benefit of a high-level performance standard. The third point is that these mechanisms can provide funding that support the other priority mechanisms that the group has identified. And then I'll close by echoing something Dave said at the outset, which is that we should recognize and we need to communicate to the council that a suite of complementary policies is required, and there's no single silver bullet. We've known for decades that we need a variety of approaches, and they can be made complementary and we can avoid making them unnecessarily additive. We can use one to make the other one less expensive. And that's a matter of program design. Thanks.
Thanks, Rich. That's helpful. Okay. Folks, we're going to need to be tight in how we're doing this, because we're going to need to do this in the other groups as well. Joey, you're up next.
Well, I will be really brief. I appreciate so many of the comments that folks have already made. I very much appreciate the work of the thermal task group. Obviously, very thoughtful, comprehensive, underscoring Sam's point about, how you did focus on equity, and Liz's point of how we need to ensure that as these interrelate. But I very much, so that's top of mind, I think, for all of us, but also appreciating all of the points that Rich just made and affirmed that, this is the direction we need to head. So this seems like directionally very right to me. So just appreciate, and I will pass the baton.
Thanks, Joey. That's great. Melissa?
Yeah, I'll also be quick. Just wanted to note that there's I'd say a level of pragmatism and timing considerations that underscore these recommendations. The thermal sector was kind of in a tricky position in that we have a clean heat standard on the books, but the costs and impacts of that policy weren't necessarily vetted up front. And now we're in a position of uncertainty around the disposition of the clean heat standard. And so our task group very much talked about, rather than going back to square one, is there incremental progress we can make in other areas while we reevaluate an overarching policy? So this top one, one overarching policy that's going to take years to develop and stand up, and those impacts will need to be vetted. what is done with the revenue sources will need to be considered and determined. And are there essentially no regrets policies we can implement in the interim? And weatherization came to the top as one of those policies. We don't need to study it more. We can put a pretty prescriptive recommendation forward there. So I just would note that some of these are more short-term recommendations versus coupled with a long-term recommendation. And I very much appreciate Liz's comment, acute observation that we need to look at the cumulative impacts when you stack these recommendations up. What is the impact on Vermont households?
Yeah. Okay. So what I'm hearing is a lot of support for these sort of 4 key ideas that you would lift up to complement the big package that you'll have as well on buildings and thermal. I've heard the need to articulate more clearly the thinking that's gone in, whether it's thinking around equity and impacts on diverse Vermonters or low-income Vermonters. And that's something we probably don't have time to do right now, but something that needs to be baked into this perhaps better so that you can show you've done that thinking. I'm not sure I've heard other things that would alter what we're doing here. I felt like the comments have been helpful framing about this. So let me just double check. Is there anything that people would need to see changed or altered from what the presentation you just received, right? Which is better than my PowerPoint right now because it has more detail. But is there anything that you saw there, you're like, oof, I am just not comfortable, as a full subcommittee standing behind this? Is there anything in that category? Sam?
I don't think I would go even remotely that far, but I do want to note that perhaps a useful takeaway, and I appreciate the working group's patience with me on this one, is that one of the things that I'd like to see make sure goes along with this is that it's looking to, when we look at this, besides the recommendations from other committees, so not just within cross-sector, but other committees, we are really missing that community scale. These are focused really broad scale or building specific. And I think we know that we have a lot of infrastructure gaps at the broader sort of neighborhood or whole town sort of municipal scale, and a lot of gaps there. And so as we look at what rural resilience and what other folks have come up with, I just want to highlight that it would be great to make sure that's complementary and that's not something that gets dropped entirely when we're looking at them across the whole, because I do think that given our size as a state, it's challenging to come up with the funds and the admin and all that other stuff that goes along with that sort of scale of project or work. And so making sure that we're thinking about how we're going to tackle that as a state is really important.
Thanks, Sam. And I'm glad you framed it that way, because indeed it's hard when we're in one subcommittee to see across all the other stuff that might be coming out of others. And so thanks for that framing. All right, let's do a quick pause for public comment, because we wanted to do that after each of these. And so if Annette or others that aren't members of the subcommittee that have some thoughts for the subcommittee on this specific issue, now's a great time. Annette?
Yes, this is in response to your specific question, David. The equipment performance standard. I was shocked to see that, actually. So it says that any new thermal appliance has to have 0 emissions. So would somebody please tell me where I can buy a propane furnace that has 0 emissions? And this is rather important to me right now because I've been without heat for 3 weeks with my propane furnace. So I'm at risk of having my water and sewer line freeze. And I have been struggling to get a $25 part, which was missent to Florida. And then when it came, they sent the wrong part. So I'm now paying $166 in extra shipping, hoping to get it here by 3:30 today, and for a $25 part. Now I've asked, is there another furnace I can get? Well, I can get the same furnace that I have, and my furnace is from 1995. I talked to another propane dealer who has something similar, but it's not 0 emission. So I wonder if you all are living in the real world, because I am. And I don't have the alternative of just electrifying everything. And I'm very upset by what I'm hearing, because you're talking about, low and moderate income people. Okay, well, I'm a moderate income person, but it, at the end of the day, the technology is what it is. And if there is no alternative that is zero emission, why are you making that recommendation at all? You want to push people to use electricity? Well, fine. Well, I'm off grid. So here's my electric option. I buy a milk room heater, and I run my gasoline generator to run the milk room heater every couple hours. And that's what I'm going to have to do if that part doesn't arrive today. This is the real world. I'll also remind you, in response to Dave Farnsworth's comment about we needed to be doing more with hot water demand response. Andrea Cohen from Vermont Electric Co-op told you at your last meeting that doesn't work. You are not considering the impacts of what you're recommending to rural Vermonters. This goes way beyond, electrification. A lot of us rely on propane, for which we have no alternative. Please delete any recommendation that says that any new appliance has to be zero emissions, unless you can show me one right now that I can buy right now to replace my dead furnace. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. Appreciate that. And just before I go back to any reactions from the subcommittee, anybody else who's joined the call today has a thought? Okay. Welcome, Jared, Dave, you want to have some response to that before we move on to the next group?
Thanks, David. Yeah, and I think that I want to respond to Annette's concern, and I think that if we had had more time, we would have been able to share a lot more of the nuance and detail, which let me share that now to allay some of those concerns. We are not focused on a performance standard where there is not technological or market readiness, and some of the exemptions that are in the longer, more detailed recommendation include for off-grid homes, include for mobile homes. It includes a market and technological feasibility study. It includes different phase-in dates for different types of equipment. So, there is a lot of nuance there. It is not a blanket across the board performance standard. It is a performance standard designed to phase in a move to zero emissions equipment for newly installed equipment when and where there is technological and market feasibility. And so there's a lot more detail that's really relevant, but I just want to be very clear that the detailed text of that recommendation, which we thought we didn't have time to go through there, adds a lot of that really important nuance that addresses some of the concerns that you raised.
Thanks, Jared. Dave?
Thanks for that question, Annette. You're right. Andrea Cohen said that VEC couldn't do it last week, and I had a talk with him since then. And I won't go into the calculations, but they probably have tens of thousands of water heaters that are electric resistance, that pop on when the temp goes down, or that pop on when people use a lot of water in the morning or in the evening. That puts pressure on system peaks. And when there's pressure on system peaks, the company has to go out and invest more money in supply or in system build out. That costs everybody money. When you look at a 4 kilowatt water heater, and
Hey, Dave, can I interrupt you for 1 second here? Because the demand management stuff isn't actually part of this group of recommendations. And if we want to make it part of the electricity ones, we could talk about it there if you're okay with that.
No, I'm not. I just wanted to answer a question, David. I need about 30 more seconds, but thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, there's an opportunity out there in that to avoid upward pressure on rates. Pressure that's going to hit everybody, and it's called managing water heaters, managing EVs. And GMP has a perfectly good program that does it. No reason that some other utilities in Vermont shouldn't be able to do it as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate that. Sorry to interrupt. All right. why don't we pivot over to the next piece, which I think is transportation. I'm not looking at my agenda right now. Yeah. Why don't we jump into transportation and we'll do a similar exercise of hearing sort of where they landed and then having a discussion about it. So let me turn it over to folks from transportation. I see Joey, you came off mic.
Yeah, maybe David, thanks. Maybe I can start, and it'll be similar and it'll also be very different. I think the very thorough nature with the PowerPoint that the thermal team just walked through is going to be a little different than what we want to walk and talk through with you all today. So I'm going to start, provide a little context, and then invite other members of the task group to weigh in. But so just let me first start by apologizing for the delay in getting our transportation task group's sort of draft priority recommendations to the co-chairs and to you all. The good news, though, is that our top recommendations have not really changed substantially from those we recommended in the 2021 adopted climate action plan. We still believe there are a few key strategies and actions that are, we need to meet our obligation as a climate council to craft a climate action plan that adds up to the science-based targets in the GWSA. I think we are well aware that those science-based targets are set forth by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, part of the Paris Climate Accord. Governor Scott committed to them in 2017 when he said we're still in on Paris when Donald Trump withdrew us from that climate agreement. So now we have those commitments enshrined through the GWSA. And so our work in the transportation sector and collaboratively across all these issues is to add up, create a plan that adds up. And so in the transportation task group, we've identified a few key strategies, as I've said, that we think are fundamental to meeting the GWSA targets, as well as raising the sustainable revenue necessary to invest in priority programs like electric vehicle incentives, mileage smart, transit, microtransit, and more, which is important because, as you may or may not know, recent lack of funding has fairly abruptly stalled and stopped some of our key programs, like our state's EV incentive program, the Mileage Smart program, which has been an incredibly successful climate and equity program, which has been focused on moving lower income earning Vermonters into higher mileage and electric vehicles, all electric now at the end. At the same time, some of our transit agencies have been cutting back routes as they face budget challenges. So that's kind of the exact opposite direction of where we need to be heading. So more to do in sustainable revenue, and a program and policy framework that enables it has really been top of mind. So regarding our priority recommendations, where we want to start focusing this conversation, as you'll see, really build off the good frameworks and work already underway in Vermont through our state agencies, our distribution utilities, our community action agencies, and others. We have a list of a lot of different actions, but to elevate the three we really wanted to talk to you about today. I'm wondering, I did share.
I can share them. Yeah,
That'd be
give me 1
great.
second. I'll pop them right up on the screen.
Okay, thank you. They're pretty brief. Our three things we really want to put on the table for consideration and conversation with you all and others as priorities are adopting a cap and vest policy to reduce emissions in line with GWSA requirements, and raising a sustainable revenue source to fund necessary transportation programs. So that's recommendation 1. Recommendation 2, continuing the electrification of the transportation sector across weight classes by supporting the availability, accessibility, and affordability of electric vehicles and reliable EV charging options for all, including through ongoing participation in and likely defense of California's waiver to adopt programs and participate in the Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks program, et cetera. And then 3, planning for and developing local and regional priorities for investment in a multimodal transportation system, including through land use planning strategies, investments that will support compact community settlements and all the transportation pollution reduction benefits and other health and community benefits that kind of development can provide. So please note, just so you know, the language I'd originally shared was a little confusing. So this is the language we hope to put forward and explore with you today, which is really focused on, state investments and federal investments follow the lead of the identified priorities of communities and regions when it comes to making needed transportation investments. So those are the three buckets, and within each of those three sort of priority strategies, we also recognize, discuss, and clearly know the need for and the opportunity to ensure that these recommendations consider, respond to, and meet critical equity and affordability goals, helping all Vermonters, regardless of income, access and enjoy the benefits of cleaner, more cost-effective transportation options. Recognizing too that the status quo of high cost, price volatile fossil fuels is not serving people well. We think there's an opportunity and an obligation to craft something like a cap and invest program in particular to be designed through revenue allocation and otherwise to really address equity considerations and concerns. So looking forward to doing more of that thinking and work with you all. But before I wrap and offer others on the task group to weigh in and then open it up to hearing from you all, just a couple of other things that are important to note. One of them, Rich already he highlighted already, but just thinking really important to underscore. So we have an incoming federal administration that is made clear its interest in doubling down on fossil fuels. Highly irresponsible and short-sighted in my humble opinion, but they've been abundantly clear, and that means there's a lot of uncertainty as it relates to core supportive programs and incentives and funding, like those programs and incentives embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as in the market driving mechanisms like the Advanced Clean Cars 2, which is enabled by California's waiver, which, as you know, allows states like California, Vermont's joined on, to establish more stringent standards for auto manufacturers to obligate them to deliver increasingly high amounts of electric vehicles for sale in the states with those programs. So this is all creates a high level of uncertainty. And what it means for our work is, again, to be determined, but we still believe that our recommendations that we're putting forward are really important. And then last thing I would say as it relates to the cap and invest piece in particular, as you are well aware, I'm sure, there is some ambiguity because related to adopting a cap and invest program, which we had recommended in the initial climate action plan, but our initial recommendation was joining the Transportation and Climate Initiatives cratered at the last minute. So now there is an in-depth analysis underway led by VTrans and ANR with an independent consultant that is set to inform what would be a priority recommendation. That analysis is not due until February 15th of 2025. So as you'll see, we haven't offered an exact, more concrete recommendation around exactly what program to join. And so we don't know exactly what that means and how we would structure it to deliver, equity and affordability outcomes, those cost-effective greenhouse gas emissions reductions, et cetera. So, but what we do know is that we need a mechanism that establishes a cap to reduce pollution emissions in line with the law and also creates a sustainable revenue source. So, which is what a cap and invest program would do. So we have other recommendations that we'd love to, we sort of highlighted some of those in a previous meeting past. I'm happy to walk and talk through some of those. I think there's been a lot of good input and I did get to listen to the cross-sector meeting where the utilities weighed in, which was very helpful, and really looking forward to maybe working more with the electric task group and part of the subcommittee to think about our recommendations. But at this point, I'd like to ask other members of the transportation task group to round out anything I might have missed. And those members are Andrea Cabral from VTrans, Gina Campoli of Craftsberry, Eric Schultz from the Northeast Kingdom Community Action Agency, Jared Duval and Bram Klepner, fellow climate councils, and Deirdre Ritzer from Vermont's Department of Environmental Conservation's Air Quality and Climate Division. So if they all have any further insights on the insights or thoughts on the 3 recommendations in particular we put forward for conversation and consideration today, or anything else, I definitely appreciate them following me, and then looking forward to everyone else's thoughts, questions, insights, concerns.
Thanks, Joey. Really appreciate that. Okay. I'll keep this up for now and let me know when to drop it. Gina, jump in, please.
Yeah, I just want to underscore VTrans' contribution to 3 significant pieces of research that undergird these recommendations. One is the Cap and Invest program research that's going on that Joey mentioned, but also they undertook a carbon reduction strategy, which is a look at their programs in transit and rail and bike ped and what the emissions benefits are today and how much more investment would be needed to get to where we need to go. So was really important information to back our decision-making today and VTrans in the future. And then finally, there was a smart growth study, which was part of the last plan. And that wrapped up earlier this year. It was a partnership with VTrans and ACCD. And that, through some very sophisticated modeling, looked at the effects of growing up to 2050 land use in terms of land use growth, and what that will mean if we grow in a sprawling pattern versus in a concentrated pattern. And there are real benefits, tangible data-driven benefits to future growth being in downtown and village center. So those pieces of work are really important in support of what we're talking about here. And I want everybody to be aware of it. And we can get into much more details if people are interested in those research projects.
Thanks, Gina. That's really helpful. All right. So that's some introduction to this work. Folks who've been tracking this, but now maybe this is the first time you haven't been as involved with this task group. Any questions, thoughts, reactions that you'd want to bring up now to this task group and what they're putting forward here? Is this looking good? Looking like the right thing, Rich?
Well, I have 2 questions for the group. In the absence of, well, either in the absence of Clean Cars 2, continuing or getting yanked if the Trump administration repeals the waiver, or even with it, did you all discuss the idea of purchase incentives for electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles in Vermont in the meantime? And perhaps including what used to be called a fee-based program or an incentive program that we could do on our own regardless of federal law? That's one question. And the second question is, can you say something about WCI versus NICI with respect to Vermont's ability to enter into an agreement that would cover only the transportation sector, or does it have to be economy-wide?
And I'll just note, Rich, that maybe we need to wait for that Cap and Invest study for that final question. That's a perfectly fine answer. I'll just put that out there. Before I grab Dave's hand, quick answers to Rich's questions.
And I welcome others on the task group to round out, but yes, we have talked about the EV incentive. While I mentioned the EV incentive programs, the state incentive program has gone away. We do still have incentives through, the work that the DUs are doing through the tier 3. I do understand that there is likely to be some general fund allocation to restart and reinvest in the EV incentive programs, ideally mileage smart and replace your ride as well. But that sort of like start-stop program based on general fund allocation is a little of a challenging dynamic. We still do have, and Vermonters can access, Vermonters with a tax appetite can access the up to $7,500 through the Inflation Reduction Act. So that things still exist. There's not a level of continuity through the state programs that we believe is necessary for, you know, expanding and not retracting and, you know, deeply inefficiently, you know, having programs that start and stop. So we have talked about that. I think we're going to need to be a little bit flexible and just drawing your attention to this sort of little bit vague last recommendation, planning for and developing local and regional priorities for investment in a multimodal transportation system that very well could include investment or revenue raising opportunities. The fee-based or the high mileage vehicle price adjuster, excuse me, vehicle efficiency price adjuster was a recommendation of the 2021 adopted climate action plan. We still anticipate it being a recommendation in this next adopted climate action plan. I mean, that's up for conversation and consideration. We didn't raise it today because we didn't put it at the top of the tier, but if we run out of options through federal rollbacks, we're going to have to look at other ways to maintain progress, and things like a vehicle efficiency price adjuster, other things are going to have to be on the table, in my opinion.
I mean, Rich, what we're up against here, if not this, then this, but we don't know if the first this is going to work. So it's how much do you roll out at what time? We're not done with the cap and trade program. Looking at that, are we going to be able to do it? If that doesn't work, then we've got to look at, we're very aware of fee-based and the potential to both bring the cars and to raise some revenue. So it's hard to, without knowing, we don't know to what extent California will or will not prevail. And should we get a whole plan for that? Or maybe it's going to take 4 years in court and it won't happen. It's just really, there's just a lot of unknowns around the various alternatives. I mean, I think what you see here is the ideal world scenario.
Thanks, Gina. Dave?
Thank you, David. Joey, I just wanted to commend you on these. I think these are really good approaches given the circumstances, which are really bad. I think proceeding regionally is a really useful line of inquiry. You know, potentially is a politically robust, given the situation, political situation. Reggie states did that when there was a federal administration that took all the carbon information off EPA and DOE websites. It wasn't as stringently oppositional as this next administration is going to be, probably. But Reggie was developed, strong regional approach was developed when the federal government was pushing in the other direction. And so I encourage you to stick with that. Thank you.
If we had 4 bullets, multi-state coordination would have been the 4th one.
Well, what if you?
We have a version of that. We didn't get up though, because we had a chop.
I just want to just note really quickly, sorry to interrupt, but just to underscore, Dave, appreciate your appreciation of me, this work, but this is a very big team effort with the task group. And so I'm going to share that appreciation widely with everyone who did a lot of work, including some really great work on the vehicle miles traveled reduction strategies and others. So anyway.
Can I just jump in for 1 second though? Because I think sometimes the word regional is used in multiple ways. And so in bullet 3 on the screen, regional means regional within Vermont.
Within Vermont, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So
yes.
for what Dave's saying about regional, like regional,
Multi-state.
our neighboring states kind of region, it's not crazy if you wanted to think about adding a bullet, if that's something that you all think is really important and you have some specific action you'd like to take, that wouldn't be crazy to do something like that. So I'll just note that.
We've got one all written.
Okay. Well, do you want to throw it in the
For
chat?
multi-state, what I'm talking about are multi-state initiatives.
Yeah.
At the AN conference, some of the legislators were talking about this and how important it is. Like Reggie came together because the Northeast states saw the need. Cap and trade, TCI was all about that. It's just very challenging to make those things happen because there are constitutional issues and how states, you know, how bound together can they be at a sub-national level? But I think it's what we're doing with California right now. That's a multi-state issue that's being grappled with amongst those jurisdictions. So,
Sure.
yeah,
Right, so
to the
based
extent
on-
we have to raise it up, it's embedded in number one, but
Yeah, so if there's something else and folks want to dig around and throw something in the chat that you've used that would be something for there, feel free, and we'll see if that works for y'all. Indeed, it is embedded into number one, but maybe it's something bigger. Melissa?
Yeah, I'll echo the appreciation for the task group for bringing this together. And I think directionally, these look really great. Probably do have room for one more bullet if we want, in terms of staying within our prioritization limit. I just wonder if we want to be on number two. Do we want to be more explicit about continuing funding for the EV rebate programs? The affordability is flagged there, but I see that as distinct from continuing to stand behind clean cars too. So I just would throw that out for the subcommittee's consideration. I think it's, you know, Joey, you mentioned the general fund appropriations. We might get some this year, great. And, you know, I think you, Regina, made the point like that up and down funding is really challenging for the market. So I think I'd like to see something explicit in advance of a cap and invest policy, which would, of course, bring revenue, but that's going to take years. So something more short-term on funding would be helpful.
Great. So add into bullet number two, explicit shout out about funding for rebate programs. Okay. Andrea?
Yeah, I'm just getting stuck in that one for a second, but I just wanted to bring up the possibility or the discussion of combining some of what's here with what was presented with buildings and thermal. And are we looking for opportunities to combine some of the actions that we're recommending? Like a market mechanism,
Right.
i.e. cap and invest.
Yeah, great question. And I think that is an opportunity here, right? Is to have two task groups lean into a single thing and write it in a way that meets the needs of both task groups. That's a total possibility. You all know your content better, whether that works or doesn't work, but it's, I would say, explore it. Jared, did you want to react on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is that when these are kind of pithy summations, right? But they're in the more detailed language of each of these, both from the thermal task group draft and in the transportation task group draft. The cap and invest language says including but not necessarily limited to the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel sector in the thermal recs, and including but not necessarily limited to the transportation sector in the transportation recommendation. So both draft recommendations and the full detail of the language do hold open the possibility of of covering multiple sectors through the cap and invest program. And I think that there is a really clear, good, and appropriate alignment between these recommended strategies that reflects what we know from the evidence from other states and jurisdictions. You know, we're the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. We're responsible for developing and putting forward recommendations to reduce climate pollution. And when you look across other states and jurisdictions, there are really two clear sets of policies that can accomplish that with confidence, on schedule and with some degree of clarity. And those are emissions cap programs, cap and invest programs, and their performance standard programs, either applied to equipment or to fuels. And so it's no surprise, you know, emissions don't just go down on their own. And there are other complementary programs that can be helpful. They may be more uncertain, they may be more marginal, but in terms of the core recommendations that we can have a degree of confidence that we can actually achieve the legal obligations of the Solutions Act and the charge that we've been given by state law, there, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise. we're focused on the things that have proven with evidence in other jurisdictions. It's emissions cap and invest programs, and it's performance standards focused on equipment and fuels. And we see both of those recommendations as the priority strategies for both of these task groups, which to me is a really positive thing in terms of aligning with the evidence and the examples of other states, and in terms of the alignment of the strategies and the efficiency of those strategies.
Great. Okay. All right. So what I've taken in terms of notes on this, let me start with things that would make some changes. One change could be in number 2, be more explicit about continuing the funding for rebate programs. So add that language into your second bullet. The second thing I have is maybe there's a 4th bullet about proceeding regionally in terms of with neighboring states or other states on efforts. So Gina just threw it in the chat. Great. Work across states and partner on multi-state policies, blah, blah, blah. So that could be a 4th one. You can see it in the chat there. So that I'd be interested to take everybody's pulse on that. I'm just going to put in my notes right now the actual language. So those are 2 things that would involve changes. The third that might involve changes is what we just talked about would you eventually merge a recommendation around a cap and invest with the thermal group? Maybe, maybe not, but they're both getting at this idea of the possibility of a multi-sector program. Then there's some inputs, there were some questions, and then there's some inputs like, hey, by the way, there's really good research that's backing all this, was the research that VTrans has done, what Jared just mentioned, and the experience from other states. And that all is important background that should be part of framing language of why these are lifted up as priority actions. That's what I've got in my notes. I'm curious if there's anything else folks want to say about these priority actions. Joey?
I just have a process question, but maybe I want to defer to others who haven't spoken first. So
Alec, yeah.
All right, thanks. I guess I would just ask maybe a context question, and I apologize if this has already been litigated through the process. I'm relatively new to the department. But could someone provide sort of a rationale for the market-based approach in the first place? I've both Rich and Jared have sort of extolled the virtues of cap programs and mandates around
Alec, we just lost your audio. Something weird just happened with Alec's audio. I don't know if others can hear him, but I can't. Yeah.
Peace.
There we go. Wait, you just came back, Alec, and we lost you the last 15 seconds.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I don't know where you lost me, but basically just reiterating that I would appreciate a little bit more context around why the market-based solution is the preferred approach when people have been repeatedly extolling the virtues of caps and manufacturing standard mandates and those kinds of things.
Got it. Folks from subcommittee, task groups, it sounds like you're suggesting both, right? The second bullet is about maintaining ACC2 and all and supporting all that. But Rich and Jared, real quick.
Yeah, well, I think the experience across the world really is that both flexible devices that operate through delivering a price signal, which is, as I said earlier, it's not really market-based, it's delivering a price signal, are directionally correct and they can raise revenue that can then be targeted both to address equity questions and also efficient implementation questions. So the term market-based isn't really the most important term there. The term is, I mean, what's important is creating price signals for implementation in sectors where there are, particularly where there's a variety of implementation techniques to deliver on the goals. And it's not just a single regulatory technique that will deliver all the savings that are going to be needed. So I don't think we are just saying that market-based approaches are the way to go. We're saying a combination of price signals, funding sources, and regulatory strategies are all needed.
Thanks, Rich. Jared?
Yeah, and for me, I think it goes back to the statutory guidance in the Solutions Act. So we're given a charge to put together a plan with recommendations that achieve the emissions reduction obligations and do it cost effectively. And I think that the example, when we look at the research of what has happened in the electricity sector with cap and invest programs like RGGI and with performance standards like renewable portfolio standards or renewable energy standards, or when we look to other states that have done cap and invest programs and performance standards on the non-electricity sectors, we see that they have been able to reduce emissions more significantly than we have. California's achieved twice the level of emissions reduction we have over the last 20 years, and very cost effectively because of the incentive to identify the lowest cost per ton reductions. I think my question would be, compared to what, and what is the alternative? Oftentimes the main alternative that is put forward instead of a cap and invest program or instead of a performance standard is a carbon tax. And I think that I am less supportive. I am not supportive of a carbon tax for multiple reasons. One is it gives, as classically designed, they give clarity about the amount of revenue raised, but fail to give clarity on actually achieving emissions reduction. And so if we're trying to achieve pollution reductions in a cost-effective way and generate revenues to hold folks harmless and provide equity-focused investments for low and moderate income Vermonters, the example of the program that has been able to do that is clearly cap and invest programs in California, in Quebec, via RGGI, et cetera. There is much less evidence in the United States, especially, that a carbon tax approach is one that confidently delivers emissions reduction and can advance equity in the same way. So, there are design details that matter, but and I appreciate the point that, some of these phrases, it's important to pause and say, what do we mean? What do we really mean by them, and get clarity on the definitions. And market-based may be too broad. But what I would say is when we look at the evidence from other sectors and other states, that cap and invest policies have proven to be the most successful at achieving the things that we're legally obligated to achieve.
Thanks, Jared. TJ?
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully this is relevant, but my understanding of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and this was informed by something I think you told me, Jared. So I hope I'm not misstating, but that you just talked about cost effectiveness a lot, and the Global Warming Solutions Act says we have to choose the policies that meet the goals in the most cost effective way, but it does not require the policies to be cost effective. And that, I think, is a distinction that was pointed out to me like a year and a half ago. And I just want to be clear as we talk about it. I think that personally, I think that's not a good framing of in the Global Warming Solutions Act, but it is the way it's stated, that we have these targets that we have to meet, whether they're cost effective or not. And so I just want to be clear, because either I'm wrong, or the way you framed that last piece, Jared, generally I just want to be clear that cost effectiveness, I think it should matter, but it may not matter. And maybe the Climate Council should think about, and this committee should think about, whether it needs to recommend that, hey, if we're recommending statutory change, maybe we should think about cost effectiveness, and that things should be cost effective, even societally. So I just want to make that clarification so that everybody's on the same page, because I don't think cost effectiveness has been in the conversation enough. And that's why. It's because the Global Warming Solution Act doesn't care about cost effectiveness.
Thanks, TJ. All right. Jared, quick reaction to that, and then
if you want to move on, David, that's okay. But I put the language in the chat, and I would just say I don't think it's fair to say that the Global Warming Solutions Act is not focused on cost effectiveness. I would draw folks' attention to the bolded part there, that there are more or less cost effective ways to achieve emissions reduction, and the Solutions Act clearly tells us to make recommendations that achieve those emissions reductions in the most cost effective manner. I would also say, and I understand that this may be different for folks who work in the administration, but my understanding as an appointed climate counselor is that our job is to put together recommendations and a climate action plan that is in line with and responsive to the law as it exists. If there are folks who want to recommend changes to the Global Warming Solutions Act, I think that is more the job of politicians and folks in the legislature and folks in the administration. But as appointees to a council that is given a very clear legal charge, I think we have to work within that legal framework as it exists, rather than focus on what we individually would change about it.
Okay. And that is a dilemma for the council to work on, for sure, is clarifying that. All right, Rich, last word, and then I want to do pause for some public comment, and we need to take a break as well.
TJ, you raised a really good question. I guess I have two responses. I'm somebody who grew up with the whole principle of cost effectiveness as a utility regulator, so it resonates with me quite a bit. I'm not aware of policies that we have promoted that would not be societally cost effective. That's point number one. If you consider the social cost of carbon emissions, and I would be interested to modify any policies if we thought they were not going to be societally cost effective. So I'm in agreement with you that I would work hard to amend those policies, figure out how we can get to where we need to go more cost effectively. The second is just to remind us all that we suffer under the burden not just of climate change, but the burden of the high price of fossil fuels that are being paid year in and year out by Vermonters, and that we need to consider cost effectiveness with an investment timeframe in mind. And if necessary, we need to figure out how to invest now to save money for Vermonters over time by lowering our fossil bills. And that it raises questions about how can we intelligently finance some of the work that has to happen now under the policies that we're recommending. And those financing policies, frankly, have not yet been presented, other than raising revenue. Whereas I think we need a more sophisticated combination of policies that would somehow allow us to invest in weatherization, invest in fuel switching and new equipment, invest in cleaner cars, and pay for that over time out of the fuel savings that they would deliver. So, this is a much bigger question that we haven't really addressed. I'm not suggesting that we get
As-
sidetracked
Yeah.
today.
I was about to
but-
say, Rich, it'd be interesting if we wanted to put something on the table that maybe hasn't been on the table yet. If not, I would say, project for the future kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. It's not here today, but there are proposals for green bank, the creation of a green bank. There's a proposal for tariffs on bill financing to pay for weatherization and heat pumps. I mean, there are ways that we could do this that would deliver cost savings to Vermonters from the get-go by lowering our fossil bills.
Okay. One thing I'm trying to do in my notes is sort of capture like what to do with some of these comments. I'm honestly not sure what to do with this last round of comments around cost effectiveness. I saw Melissa dropped in the chat the prioritization guidance. I think that's where that came from, is the prioritization guidance, which gave a little more detail about how the council and the subcommittees should think about cost effectiveness in this moment of looking at recommendations. So I'm just not quite sure what to do with that set of conversations in terms of the results of this subcommittee. If folks have a clear ask about that, Melissa?
I don't know. I guess I just think it's important to underscore and carry up to the council that the point that cross-sector mitigation struggles uniquely with the charge to ensure that the GWSA GHG reduction emissions requirements are met. That is our primary charge. And GWSA, TJ is right, does not require that those emissions reductions be cost effective. So we can do what we can to ensure equity and affordability, but at the end of the day, we're charged with meeting GHG reductions, whether or not they're cost effective either to consumers or society writ large. And I just think that tension needs to be flagged. It's what underscores most of the struggle that we're having in formulating our recommendations.
Okay. Okay, I want to, if there's folks who aren't members of the subcommittee, we had a little bit of that, but if other folks who aren't members of the subcommittee who would love to make a comment now about what we've been talking about in transportation, this would be a moment to do that. Anybody else who's not a subcommittee member? Okay. So I've been putting this in my little PowerPoint here. Hang on, let me get it to the right size for us to look at it. Sort of, give me 1 second. So as we're going today, I'm just sort of doing a high level set of notes here. And, it could be that we decide that we're going to make some common version of, sorry, about this, right, and this. And there's going to be some sort of common version of that or not, right? But it's just a thought. But these are like the high level bullets, and we were taking notes about the kind of context and the kind of what needs to be in here as well, so we don't lose some of the really important nuance where you're going to find the issues around equity or cost effectiveness or other things like that. All right, so we're making progress. We were slated to take a break. We're actually miraculously somewhat ahead of schedule, which is a nice place to be in. Why don't we do this? It's about 5 or 7 minutes before the hour. Why don't we break until 2:00? If folks want a 15-minute break, let's break until 2:10. If that's all right. Maybe if you didn't grab lunch, now's a good time. Andrew, do you want to say something? And Gina?
Sorry, just like for 30 seconds, that last work across the region, we can talk about it more. I see it as an important framing for what should be happening. I feel like it goes without saying, but maybe a lot of this does from my point of view. But yeah, I just feel like it's really squishy. It's not tangible. It's not measurable really, unless it's going to be measured under a bunch of different actions. So I'm not a fan of including that, but.
Right. So maybe it's more of a context setter than a priority action.
That's what it feels like would be better served that way.
Okay. Could be, yeah. Unless there's something specific that we wanted to laser in on. Gina?
There's a lot of
My
specifics. I
my
think.
question is somewhat related to that. What happens to all the other strategies and actions that we've spent
They
so much
all,
time on?
go. Everything goes, and they're all
Everything
part of
goes?
the
Oh,
climate
okay, I
action
didn't know
plan.
that.
Yeah, yes, right. Yeah, and it's different this year, right? Because the council is saying, in addition to the full package, right, the full Excel file that has everything, in addition to that, we're asking for some things that we lift up and are going to be highlighted at the top of the plan, right? And there's the full tables below with all of the strategies and actions. All right, so
Which
nothing
may
is
address
lost. It's
those
just
that may
some are
address,
lifted up.
and those may address those contextual issues. Some of those strategies and actions. I mean, we assume there would be a narrative that went with the strategies and actions that would get at those contextual things.
Yeah.
I guess it's just a editing thing on where you put all this information, so it's digestible.
Yes, I think that's right. And it's a little bit of a puzzle, Gina. I'm with you of how much context you provide at the very top when you're highlighting a couple actions, because we've felt in this conversation, and I just did one with Ag and Eco as well. They do require some context, right? They require some context to show that you've done some thinking about cost effectiveness, equity, blah, 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 like all this stuff. And so if they're going to get listed up high as a sort of top 30 list of actions, there needs to be some context attached to them, or else they're too vulnerable to misunderstanding. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Anything else before we break, Liz?
I almost didn't raise my hand, but now I have to. How is that? Just someone remind me, because this is important as we get to our subcommittee lifting up recommendations. How does all of that jibe with the cross-cutting ones? In other words, like, as I hear all of this, like, I just keep feeling this urgency to say, infrastructure resiliency. It just goes across all of these things. Like you mentioned charging in the transportation, for example, the word is there, but there's nothing specific about, that infrastructure, just as an example. And same with buildings a second ago, and it will be the same for electric when we talk about it in a second. So where do those get prioritized and placed? Does our subcommittee have to do anything on that yet, or are we not doing anything on that until we get further along?
So there's different types of cross-cutting issues, Liz. Like there's 3 in which there's specific groups that Liz Amler is working to facilitate, where they're looking at the land use issues, and there's going to be stuff that pops up around, for instance, like the compact development things that you're talking about here in transportation. There's a workforce one, and there's which will hit some of the things you have there. And then there's an outreach and education one. And so those are going to put up they're going to put up a suite of recommendations and a couple big, high level priority actions. Yours around resilient infrastructure feels more like something that's happening over in rural resilience, about being resilient in your infrastructure. So
yeah,
I
okay.
guess there's different.
Just we won't mitigate if we don't have that. So okay.
And I think what I want to capture, Liz, is the piece that's giving you heartburn. And is the piece that's giving you heartburn, you're like, but where's the piece about having resiliency in this infrastructure? Is
I mean, it's okay. I don't need to take the whole committee's time right now. I'm worried that we, as both a subcommittee and a whole council, are being too granular and one by onesie rather than big picture. And it goes to a comment I made a couple meetings ago that having the cross-cutting things sort of follow or be at the end, which I think we're going to remedy, hopefully.
Correct.
We just need to really be thinking about that, because, this is a communications document. And if what we're communicating is a set of 30 somewhat higher priority items than the 200 others we have in the appendix, that's one thing we could communicate. But there might be something a lot more impactful and accurate, bluntly, of our opinion that doesn't come through that way. So anyway, just thinking about how that's all going to work. I'll stop.
I appreciate that, Liz. And I think the communication of this and how to be thematic and also specific is a nice tension to play with, because there may be thematic things that are, you know, to be high up in the plan in addition to these priority actions. All right. Why don't we come back at 2:10 if folks are okay with that? Or if you want a 15-minute break, 2:15. Do folks need an extra minute, 2:15? Why don't we do that? That keeps us on schedule, which is great. So we'll be back at 2:15. And thanks, everybody. We can just put yourself on mute and we'll be back. Hey, folks, welcome back. All right. It would be helpful. Yeah, thanks, folks, for coming back on camera. That's helpful to know who's around. All right. Looks like we have a critical mass circling back in. Thanks, everyone. It's very hard to have lunch in a 14-minute break. So sorry to anyone else who is trying to scarf down some food. All right, so next up is to do the same thing with electricity. Liz, you asked if I could pull up presentation from the 14th, and I can. Just give me 1 second.
Great. Do you want me to start us off while you're looking for that?
Yeah, why don't you just give a update of sort of what's going on and
Less than for the other two task groups.
okay, fair enough.
With apologies for my own vacation the week prior to Thanksgiving and last. And I know other task group members have likewise been busy. Our task group has not completed the prioritization that you all have already done. You can go to the first full slide, I guess. And while that's bad news generally from a, to-do and timeline point of view, we view it as good news, or at least I'm going to spin it that way, because so much of what we are suggesting is in support of mitigation in the other sectors, given what we all know about the electric sector and the information, Jared flashed up on the screen at the beginning of this meeting, that I think, speaking for my own understanding, and others can weigh in, of course, this will give us a chance to look at what we've come up with to date and prioritize and select and even reorder priorities, as it were, pathways, as it were, based upon the feedback and work others have done. So I think that'll be the extent of my introduction, with the note that at least prior to the break, all of the task group members were with us. Sam Lash, TJ Poor, Peter Sterling, and Rich Cowart. And so if any of them want to say something before I remind folks about the pathways and the potentially complementary actions, and then solicit input on where you all think priorities should be in light of the work you've done, that would be my proposed path. Comments from the task group, if any, and then we dive in, reminding and prioritizing, getting solicitation on priority, rather.
Super. Anyone else from that task group want to jump in real quick before we walk through this?
Yeah, I was just gonna really quickly, thanks Liz for teeing this up. I know we haven't really had a chance to speak much. This is really helpful. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of say, from the perspective of the Just Transitions group, that something along the lines of ensuring that all Vermonters can participate in income-based programs regardless of utility area, or things like those kind of really small granular things. I understand they're really hard to fit into the pathway strategies and actions, and I totally respect and understand that. But then it makes me wonder, and I'm just bringing it up here and a little bit before as well, but that maybe there are some best practices or some other version of highlighting some of these things that, well, maybe that needs to happen in Just Transitions or whatnot, but that, again, it's hard to really include at this scale with the pathway strategies and actions, but we don't want to lose, because that's what a lot of folks really care about. And in terms of thinking about public engagement, and again, as this is a communication document, ensuring that folks see their own feedback and see themselves reflected in the document, I think is a really important point. So not at all criticism of this or any other working group, but just to point out that the scale, I think, is tough, and we're going to keep having that tension. So I do hope we think about it.
Thanks, Sam. And I think if there's specific things, in addition to the general point you're making, Sam, but the specific things of like you know, ability to access income-based programs that we want to try to get in here. I think that's absolutely fair game to try to get it in even today.
Great.
I just, before you go in, Liz, thank you for taking the lead on presenting this. And I just want to also just characterize this, for at least from my opinion, as kind of a brainstorm list, nothing more and nothing less. And so the committee should take it that way. Some of the bullets here, and that's how it was presented last time around. And so some of the bullets here maybe don't even belong on any list, as opposed to being determined for priority. So, and there could be, and on the other hand, there could be other things that aren't on the list. I think that would be actually really helpful today. Other things that aren't on the list that should be on the list and considered for prioritization. So, thanks.
Thanks, TJ. And TJ, quickly on that, you know, today's kind of an important day because we are at a crunch time from just timing point, like trying to finalize this stuff in the next week. And so if there are things like TJ that you're like, I don't really want to have that come out of this task group, now's a great day to lift that up. And the second point as well is like if there's something missing.
Yeah, well,
Not feel
arguably,
shy.
yeah, thank you. Arguably, you could say that the members of the task group didn't get it together to get together, and maybe that just means that none of this stuff is a priority compared to buildings and like the thermal and the transportation sectors. And I don't know if I even agree with that. So I just want to put that out there, though, that the committee could decide, hey, our top priorities are all in thermal and all in transportation. And that it's just like a piece of evidence along the way. So, yeah. Especially given the main pathway from last year or last time around was completed or implemented. So.
Right. There was a lot of success. All right.
Yeah.
Well, with that context, Liz, you
Sure.
want to walk
Yeah.
through?
And the further context, TJ, your point being that the primary goal here being mitigation, because, I'd probably take up the argument if it's something more general with regard to resiliency, as we talked about before the break, but your point is well taken with regard to the primary task of this subgroup, which is seeking mitigation. Okay, it might be helpful, David, literally to flip through so that people remember what the three are. The first, TJ just mentioned, further reducing GHGs from the electric sector, addressed in large part, at least, by the Act last session, that will have further check-ins and inevitably over the years respond to changes as needed, but at this point does set a renewable goal of 100% on a tiered basis along the lines of our last plan. So there are some follow-up items there, but they're not, as TJ mentioned, the main event. Okay, sorry, David. Next one was enabling Vermonters to choose electrification. This, as I mentioned at the outset, is really in support of the other task groups here, because it concerns how the thermal sector and the transportation sectors will be able to reduce fossil fuels, utilizing electricity as one of the lower and at this point the lowest carbon source fuel available for those approaches. And so we have a number of complementary actions and we have not done, as we mentioned, the priority work ourselves, so would be interested in hearing more. And I note, Sam, that your point on approaches to support customer service drops, transformers, customer programs, all of the things that make electrification necessary for Vermonters across the state is captured in the third bullet, and certainly could be captured differently, but cost effectiveness and equity issues are noted there. And that's probably the place, that, at least as I heard your comment, to make sure something is said there if that's lifted up as a priority action. And then quickly, the third one, just before we open for discussion and comment, load management and grid optimization. This probably is closest to the, again, this is, I'll put it as my issue since the task group is not as a whole met to prioritize this, but this is probably closest to the system resiliency point discussed before we went on break. But we did have a pathway to make sure that the electric system as a whole is set up both to allow the mitigation through load management and to do it cost effectively and, you know, with safety and reliability in mind. And so there's a number of complementary actions, many of which are underway, but could be continued and deepened in order to support that activity. And that includes, in the third bullet again, just storage, targeted generation siting, and load management programs for customers to avoid more expensive upgrades. So that's another place where the point Sam raised, I think, is implicit, if not expressly put in there already. I'm going to stop there, David. I'm sorry to ask, but I'm open to your suggestions on how best to get further input from folks here. Given that it's 3 separate slides, I don't want to have you flipping back and forth more than necessary.
That's fine. I'm happy to keep it up and drop. You know, maybe I'll do this real quick as an example. For instance, Liz, on this slide, right, we've heard from Dave Farnsworth and others the importance of load management. This is one of these things where, you know, maybe you do want to raise something up as a priority action. And I'm curious, among all those bullets you have down there, if you were to have some sort of priority action of like really support, like it's almost what your strategy says, but you make specific shout outs to like what you want the legislature to do or what you want, you know, various public agencies to do. Like among those bullets, what's most needing to happen in the next year or two, like in your mind? And I obviously would open up to everybody else too.
Yeah, no, everyone's going to want to weigh in. And I'll just say for myself, I would probably make this pathway the first pathway. In other words, I would change the order given what has happened legislatively in the last year and make this the most important pathway for further mitigation, given those policies already in place. And if I were a voting group of 1, I would probably, you know, kind of rework what's essentially bullet 3 to include the types of customer, you know, and bluntly, things like advanced metering should be included there because it's a part of it. Advanced metering, storage, targeted generation siting, and distributed energy resource management systems that would enable customer programs across Vermont and help avoid or delay more expensive physical changes or damage to the grid. So that's the one I would do.
Great. So that's the kind of exercise it might be interesting for us to do right now in real time, like together as a subcommittee, to be like, of all this stuff, what rises up? Can we name something that feels like a priority action? And we could be a little squishy in some of it, but probably a little bit more specific in others. Okay. Rich, do you have some thoughts there?
Well, I think I would identify 2 of those sub bullets as to go together as a pair. And one of them would be the flexible load management, rate design, and non-wires alternatives, the one Liz named. You know, you could combine them. I mean, you know, frankly, the non-wires alternative or integrated resource planning for it, any of them could be written in such a way as to include the suite of things that utilities will necessarily do. And some of it is rate design, and some of it is investment strategy. And so that's why I thought of dividing it into 2 bullets.
Thanks, Richard. You know, Rich, these are the kinds of things where it's helpful to know who you're directing the recommendation or the action towards. Is this something that, for instance, the legislature needs to do to set the conditions for this? Is this something that regulators need to do to create the incentives for utilities to do them? Like, I'm just curious if there's some clarity about who needs to take action.
Well, there's, you know, in this world that we're talking about, there is in essence a partnership between the utilities and the regulator. And you can frame it either way. Utilities should do X, or you can frame it as the PUC should ensure that utilities do X. And I kind of don't feel strongly which way it should be framed. Saying that the Public Utility Commission should ensure that utilities do these two things works for me.
Right. It's more specific to sort of the action that needs to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think this kind of detailed grid management stuff is not something that I would want to toss to the legislature.
Great. Helpful. Dave?
Thank you. So I've talked at one point with the transportation subgroup, and I mentioned this to, I believe, to Rich Coward as an electric subgroup member. One thing that Vermont could do is get a sense of how many EVs in a service territory there are, in a utility service territory there are, and then how many of those EVs are being managed through, rate programs, managed programs. That's something that VTrans and the utility and the Utility Commission probably would need to coordinate on. I remember talking with the staff attorney who did the Act 55 2023 report on electric rates for EVs, that report. And I explained to him how the state of Minnesota does this, because I looked at his report and he couldn't say how many EVs were being controlled. In other words, what percentage of EVs? What's the score? How are we doing? That currently, we don't have that capacity. There's not that public information, but there's that capability. VTrans has it, the utilities have it, and perhaps the Utility Commission could recommend that they get together, or the legislature could recommend they get together. Similarly, the other example of flexible load is the large number of electric resistance water heaters in the state and the potential savings there. It seems to me that there is a significant amount of savings there. And I hear from the administration representatives all the time, they don't want to see upward pressure on rates coming out of this study. But inactivity with respect to demand that's going to come from electrification, inactivity, not controlling it, not even having an idea of how big or small it is, leaves us open to the risk of electrification unmanaged, ending up causing greater expense and putting upward pressure on rates. So this is more detailed discussion to have, but and I know Liz doesn't want to see more detail. She wants to see sort of perhaps a more general bunch of recommendations coming out of this process. But this is really basic stuff. We really don't know how many water heaters there are, how many EVs. I mean, GMP may have a sense of this. Just they're controlling about 4,000 EVs. They've tried to control about 500 more, but the customers aren't participating, something like that. But I'm not entirely sure of that. But I just think it's really important to be able to know, and for the public to know, and a climate plan to be able to reflect how many EVs there are, who's controlling them, who's not, and what the associated expenses are for not controlling electrification. That's going to happen.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm putting in my notes a piece about data and coordination around better understanding and better data and better visibility on all that. That can be a big piece of this. Yeah. TJ?
I'm not sure who the question's been asked of. We've provided, estimates of some of that data to the PUC. I don't know why they didn't put it in the report that we've gotten from the utilities. In terms of the water heaters, there's, estimates of impact on peak load and whether or not that will cause distribution upgrades, load growth related distribution upgrades. If the answer is no, then there's no value there. All that is covered in the IRPs. So I feel like there's just kind of maybe it's an information gap here because a lot of that stuff is already happening. As far as I'm aware, nobody's asked me the questions because I feel like I have answers to those questions. And so, maybe that's just the information that needs to be provided into the climate action plan here. Generally, I agree that we need to manage those loads. And, that data is an important point in kind of, especially the EV loads, because they are so big relative to what we currently have on the system and potential constraints. And so that data is maybe a critical piece, and getting that more out there would be useful. I'm struggling here, just to go back to what Rich was saying. I think there's a real difference between the PUC should require something and what this strategy says as it is right now. And so I don't want to take an opinion on it right now, but I want to, right now, it's support and expand on existing programs and policies. All of those bullets are things that are happening now. And so I just want to call out, it is a big difference to say the PUC should require that this happens, and that the state or whomever, the PUC, should support and expand on these programs that are happening. And I'll leave it at that. I'm not putting forth an opinion on that, but I just want to call out that distinction.
Thanks, TJ. I'm glad you did. Christine?
Yes, I'm pleased that Liz suggested in response to your question, David, that pathway 3 perhaps should come to the top. I think the load management grid optimization package of issues is essential and very important to get right in the CAP. And getting it right could be the difference between ending up with just strategic electrification compared to ultimately beneficial electrification, with a careful eye towards equity, justice, et cetera, in rate design and program offerings. And I personally would rather see stronger language that the PUC shall do X, Y, and Z in something like the CAP, because I think it sends a much stronger signal than language just like expand this, do more of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Yep. Sam?
Yeah, well, thanks, Christine. I think you put that well, and I would agree in terms of the stronger language, just to connect back to the concern that we talked about in the thermal and transportation sector about folks that have higher barriers to participating and many of these things, and as we disincentivize fossil fuels, that making sure that it's not just about either having exemptions for some folks, but also really thinking about what does that mean to enable everyone to participate in this. And so I think, ensuring that all are able to participate, we need that stronger language here. And I'm not suggesting that means that smaller rural utilities have to then bear the brunt of that, but I do think we need to work together to figure out how we're gonna make that happen, because it is at a higher cost, and it is more difficult to do, and maybe it's not the same set of actions, but I'd love to see maybe I'm not sure if I have specific suggested language here, but I don't have the expertise, but maybe it's an additional recommendation to address those concerns, because certainly we're seeing longer duration and more frequent outages in many of our rural communities that really impact people's willingness to participate on an individual level in most of the programs we discussed, and then also has impacts on quality and of life in our rural communities. So I know we're also addressing that through compact settlement, which fully support, obviously being an RPC, but we do have to think about some of those. So maybe maybe something around that.
Thanks, Sam. And I scrolled back a slide in part because I think these considerations are probably more clearly provided in this slide, right? Where it's about ensuring, as it says, all Vermonters And there's that third bullet that was pointed out before. So I'm wondering, Sam, as if you're mulling through this in your head, like, could you imagine a priority action that has something to do with, I don't know, customer satisfaction, quality service, right? As a key piece of making sure the sort of beneficial electrification happens. I'll just put that out there.
I honestly just think that instead of supporting and enabling what's already happening is finding a way to ensure it's happening, so that the other pathway is possible would be my recommendation.
Okay. And is happening. I just want to double check, Sam. Sorry to insist on this, but it's like you're talking about quality of service issues, like, length of outages, frequency of outages, that kind of stuff.
It's not at all limited to that. It was just an example I provided, but not all residents under all of our regulated utilities have access to the same types of demand management programs, the same types of interconnection, to the same types of electrification incentives, et cetera. So it's across all of the programs.
Got it.
So if we're gonna make sure that we can do pathway 2, I think pathway 3 has to be stronger language.
Got it. Okay. I wasn't making that connection with the two. All right, Jared.
Thanks. Without taking a position on stronger or more directive language on these, I just want to back up and agree with two things that TJ said. And to support that, I'm just going to put something in the chat again. This is the language in the Solutions Act about what the plan shall do, and it talks about the specific initiatives, programs, and strategies that the state shall pursue. And my sense is that there's a lot of language, and I understand that this is a brainstorm, but that there's a lot of language right now around supporting, encouraging, enabling, looking at, or focusing on. My sense is that for something to rise to the level of a priority recommendation that we want to lift up to the council or the audience of decision makers who would be responsible for following through on the state shall do that, whether it's the administration through rulemaking or whether it's an agency through rulemaking or the legislature through lawmaking. I think any priority recommendation should be really clear on the who is responsible and the how is it going to happen, via what mechanism. So, is it a recommendation for A&R rulemaking, a PUC proceeding, regulation through an agency or department, or a specific piece of legislation? I think that anything short of that, in terms of the encouraging, focusing on, I totally understand why it could and should be included in the overall plan, and I'm supportive of that. But I think it waters down the effect of the plan if we include in our priority recommendations things that aren't clear about who's responsible or what the mechanism is. So just wanted to appreciate and agree with what TJ said about that.
Thanks. Melissa?
Yeah, I agree with that, Jared, and it's maybe going to slightly modify the comment I was going to make, but I also just want to caution against feeling like we need to come up with a priority for this sector because we have for others. I think we can largely claim success in decarbonizing the electric sector, and I think Liz teed that up well at the beginning. And in my mind, the role of the electric sector is now to support decarbonization in transportation and thermal. I would like our priority to be minimize costs in the electric sector to promote affordability and make electrification of heating and transportation viable for households. And there could be sub actions that would have more specificity under those. But I would suggest a reframing of the pathway itself. We don't do load management, and I've said this before, we don't do load management for the sake of controlling loads. We do it to save costs from ratepayers. And then those, geo-targeting of load assets and storage could fall below that. And I also just want to be cognizant of the input that we did get from the distribution utilities a few weeks ago, and just very wary of mandating utilities shall do this or the PUC shall do this without a clear picture. We have a robust regulatory structure in Vermont for how the utilities are regulated, and they are already incentivized to reduce costs and including future costs associated with the load growth that we anticipate seeing from transportation and thermal. So I just don't want us to be in a position of feeling like we have to come up with something and it has to be really strong. I think it's okay to claim success in one area.
Okay. Thanks, Melissa. Richard?
I'm trying to somehow come up with the how do you say it? A melding of what Melissa just said and what Jared had said. The most important point is the first thing that Melissa said, which is that we can, and I think Liz also said this, which is we've done substantially well in the power sector with respect to emissions from supply, and that the critical role of the power sector at this point in time is to facilitate the decarbonization of transportation and buildings. And framing our recommendations that way, to me, is the way to go. To that end, both Liz's point about the importance of, and Dave Farnsworth's point about the importance of load management in order to moderate costs for that decarbonization, and the point made by Sam and others about making sure that the opportunities for beneficial electrification are widely available across Vermont, which those are two separate things, to me, are the two big points we want to make. So I would frame it that way, and it's a little bit already framed that way with respect to pathway 3 and pathway 2. I'm sensitive to the fact that not all utilities are presently equipped to deliver all the same services or even all the same rate designs, but that we need to make the advantages of beneficial electrification available across the entire state, and both for climate reasons and for equity reasons. And therefore, there should be a pretty strong encouragement in the climate plan for the PUC and department both to lead, direct, whatever word you want to use, utilities both to manage load and to enable electrification statewide. And I get it that it's not equally easy in all the service territories, and we shouldn't be unrealistic about that, but we should be pushing to make the benefits of electrification and the emission reductions that enables available everywhere.
So, Richard, we're to follow on that, and also taking some of the stuff that's in the chat right now. If I'm trying to wrap my head around this, one is you've got these 3 pathways and some opportunities to do stuff in the 3 pathways. You could flip around the order if you wanted to single importance. That's one thing. Another thing is if 2 of the 3 really are where the action is now, given the success in having 100% renewable energy in the portfolio standard. So this other 2 are your priorities. Would you want to craft a priority action language for those 2? Right? And if you were to craft it, what would it look like? I think that's the question. You can have all this good stuff in your package and you can put in the order you want. And the question is, do you want to frame it as maybe 2 priority actions? One that talks about managing costs through smart load management and the things we talked about, flexible load rate design and non-wires alternatives and better data, right? And you could have one about access to these programs And that's where I'm not as clear what the action is that you want folks to take around access. So just curious how others are feeling. Also quickly in the chat, Melissa, what you put, is that, you're imagining that for what is currently pathway 3? Or are you imagining that for like the whole thing encompassing all 3 pathways?
I would say that's a replacement pathway 3.
Okay.
Which would potentially rise to the top as the priority. And I like Christine's clarification.
Yep.
Right to mine.
Okay. Gritch?
Well, I mean, we're just doing this on the fly, so
yep.
I may not be as eloquent as I should be. I would not elevate cost minimization as the leading goal. I think that could be misinterpreted to promote excluding lots of things that are actually essential to promote electrification and the attainment of the emission reductions that the other policies are calling for.
Okay.
Can I ask
Jared,
Rich for you to elaborate?
Yeah, Rich, can you say a little bit more? Because it sounds like the demand management stuff has one of its core reasons for being as minimizing the additional costs from all the electrification that's going to happen, right? That's the whole goal.
Yeah, it's
one of the main goals.
But there's this question about whether service drops and transformers that enable end-use customers to plug in an EV ought to be included in rates or not. And there's a debate about that. And people would say, well, if you're minimizing costs across the board, then you wouldn't want to include those costs in utility rates. That's just one example. You could argue that, energy efficiency programs that aren't strictly cost effective, but are done for equity reasons, don't strictly minimize costs. So I just think we need to be a little more nuanced in the way we talk about this particular goal.
Thanks, Rich. That's helpful. Jared?
Yeah, I think that I appreciate the suggestion and broadly agree with the sentiment, but I think that this is another example where it's really important to be clear about definitions, including what do we mean by cost. So I would just say personally, to be comfortable with this, I'd want to see more kind of flesh on the bones of what is meant by this, because I think a lot of times when people talk about costs, they're talking about rates or what shows up on electric bills, which could include prices that are passed through from our participation in RGGI, could include the efficiency charge, but those are revenue sources that allow for investments that avoid the need for things that would be even more costly, like having to build new transmission. The return on investment from our efficiency programs has reduced overall costs for a long time. But I wouldn't want people to see this to say minimize cost means that we need to take things off of the electric bill. Now, if we're talking about more properly aligning the fees and charges and costs for energy with regard to what we then invest those funds in along a polluter pays principle, I would be very curious about and supportive of a conversation about moving costs, fees and charges away from the electric bill towards the source of our climate pollution, which is fossil fuels. But I don't think that that's what's being talked about here. So this is just, to me, kind of I'm generally, of course, supportive, but I want to be wary about supporting something broadly that lacks kind of nuance or a distinction between one type of cost versus, a long-term cost or a societal cost. And I think that this just goes back to disagreements about, or differences of opinion, or different ways of seeing what are we talking about when we talk about cost effectiveness. I think some folks don't think that we should be incorporating or calculating what are very real social costs of climate pollution, that whenever an additional ton of greenhouse gas emissions are polluted, it adds even more to the carbon loading in the atmosphere that is making extreme weather more frequent and severe, and that is creating real costs for Vermonters and people around the world. I happen to think those are real costs. Other people don't think that those should be calculated in cost-benefit analysis. But as a council, we have said we're going to follow the latest science and research on the social cost of greenhouse gases. And so I don't want to get all the way into that, but
I feel like, Jared, we're going off on a real place of cost that maybe we don't need to go.
Cost really matter and need to be detailed and landed before a recommendation like this would be appropriate.
Right. Thanks, Jared. And I think one of the things we've spun out into a place of costs more broadly than I think we wanted to, given the nature of what's in the chat. And so to pull it back to load management and optimization would be a good thing, I think, in how you do this, even if you talk about the purpose behind it being managing costs. I don't think the intent was to open up a huge can of worms on costs, but I'm not sure. Liz?
I was just going to suggest that I think this has been, for me anyway, super helpful to hear. And, with apologies for us being the task group where, the dog ate our homework, getting to TJ's earlier point that we just didn't have the opportunity to get together. And in part, that being okay because the sector has fewer immediate requirements for mitigation. It feels like the task group can take what we've heard today and now have the discussion that we otherwise could have before, including some of the points on, can you reorder the pathways or even reframe them to support the other sectors, and present something to the subcommittee. I know that from a timing point of view, time is short, but that feels like the right process. In other words, rather than writing something kind of quote on the fly, taking the input, going back to the sub-task group and doing it that way. That's what I would propose anyway, especially if my co-people are willing to do that who are on this call.
Yeah, and I think, Liz, that's right. It's hard to write in real time like this. And I will say one little asterisk to that, which is you need to send something up to the council by the end of next week. And so to do that, you want to be reviewing as a subcommittee your final drafts, and have a couple days to do that. So if you as a task group want to get together, it's going to be like tomorrow or something like that, so that you're able to give folks a couple days to read what you do. And whenever your final meeting is, whether it's next Thursday, you can review, you will have had some time to review it. So I'll just say there's an urgency in timing and on these. Dave?
Thanks, David. My question was along the same lines. I've heard a lot of really interesting things here that caused me to want to go back and look at the recommendations we made and try to accommodate as much of the comments that I've heard today that I think would be useful to us. And I realize we're under a gun, but I'm assuming we're going to have that opportunity, and we'll do our best to provide a second draft.
Yeah, Dave, and I saw that comment in the chat, and I was going to make a similar comment to what I just made, which is, and you, I think, as a way of a full subcommittee being able to look at what you're sending up at the council, you're going to need a few days to look at it. So any revisions you want to provide on the basis of today's meeting really need to have a fairly quick turnaround. So you give yourselves a little bit of time to look at new drafts with a couple days notice ahead of your Thursday meeting.
Thank you.
So like a tomorrow, Monday kind of situation. Melissa?
Yeah, I'm good with the task group taking a little bit of homework and getting it turned around quickly. We do have another meeting a week from today. I just will throw in my 2 cents again that we do have a pretty robust structure to regulate our utilities, and I want to make sure that we're not having a solution in search of a problem. and really be clear and explicit about what is the problem we're trying to solve around future load growth and avoiding costs. And it does sound like there are two concepts at play, one being the load management piece and one being kind of this desire to have consistent offerings from all of our 17 utilities. And I'll just flag that to the extent that that is referring to like heat pump incentives and EV incentives and, you know, the money, the rebates that are going to help people adopt these technologies, to the extent we mandate utilities to offer those, we are pushing costs on the electric sector, which we talked in the thermal sector about not doing that. So I just want to raise that concern again.
I'm sorry, Melissa, say that again, that
If we start mandating electric utilities to essentially offer, say, GMP is offering this incentive, everybody needs to get that same incentive statewide for electrification. So for converting transportation and heating to electric sources, that would be pushing more costs into the electric sector, which will increase electric rates and undermine electrification. I just want to be consistent subcommittee wide among our task groups, because in the thermal task group, we talked about not pushing costs into the electric sector.
Thanks.
Well, I think we'll discuss this when we get together, but we're left with a conundrum, which is that the only way to promote electrification, particularly for low and moderate income households, and to promote weatherization in those households, would be to create a revenue source that's going to help them do it. And if we are strict about saying that those revenues cannot come from the electric sector, then we need to be equally forthright about saying we really believe that they have to come from the fossil sector. And you sort of can't have it both ways, I think, if we're going to meet the obligations of the GWSA to propose a plan that would actually help all Vermonters get there. And I'm okay with that. I've said 1,000 times, I'd like to rebalance how we pay for things, but it can't just be not here and not here. We need to be, if we're going to be forthright about it, then we should be really clear and try to make sure that the revenue source is going to actually be created to promote the actions that we've identified as essential.
One thing that's helpful in looking across all three of your task groups is to see how these different things do connect. Right? So you and your other task groups are talking about using systems such as a cap and invest program as a mechanism to drive things across multiple sectors, right? Including buildings and thermal and weatherization and all that stuff, right? So I'm not sure how you talk about this, but it could be that you have some thoughtful way to talk about this is how we're imagining it here. We're trying to avoid loading this onto electricity costs in these mechanisms, et cetera. So I'm not quite sure how you do it, but if you do take that bigger view across all three task groups and what you're proposing, you may find a way to thread that needle.
I think that's a great point, David. I think avoiding costs that are occurring or at risk of occurring now should fall into that bucket as well.
Okay. Great. All right. Is there other input we want to provide on any of these three pathways, the load management pathway, the accessibility pathway, and the, making sure this is going to actually happen pathway, and happen the way you want it to? Any other feedback for this task group? Yeah, I'll jump to public comment just 1 second, Annette. Anything else from Brian? Yeah.
Yeah, not specific to that, just going back to what Rich Coward said. I think that's a insightful comment. If it's not going to be, the conversation's always has been It's not going to be from electricity, and it's not going to be from low and moderate income people, where the revenue is going to come from. And I think what I heard Rich suggesting is that we need to turn the conversation around and say, where is this going to come from? And if you take out those two, then, you know, the list starts to narrow. That would be a good exercise for the task groups to consider, I think. So thanks for sharing that, Rich.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. All right. Anything else from subcommittee members before I do some public comment? Okay. Super. I'm going to drop the slides, but I'm happy to bring them back up. Annette, please jump in if you'd like to.
Yeah, my comment is based on something that I saw in the third priority. And I'm keeping in mind that this is all about what you're going to be recommending to put in the climate action plan, which is coming out next year. We are looking at an updated RPS that has an increase in the requirement for in-state renewables. And yesterday, I listened to the ISO New England Consumer Liaison Group meeting, and I heard something said that I don't hear at all and in these discussions in Vermont. And I think it was the keynote speaker who was a member of FERC. But I know it was a woman. It was either that or the ISO New England board chair who used to be on FERC, or the ISO New England person. But it was refreshing to hear somebody say that when we do our work, we consider the impacts on communities. And that's not in here. And I never hear it. And especially in the case of electrification, there was a line in there about strategic siting of generation. And I would be very happy to see that change to include something like strategic siting of generation in collaboration with communities. And the Department of Public Service has some proposals that I think we're going to be seeing that in terms of net metering, and one of their programs does include communities. And so I have heard it before in Vermont, but I am so tired of seeing communities fighting over development projects that are heard by the PUC. I'm currently drowning in tower cases. For some reason, tower companies are on a roll citing towers. I've got 9 of them right now, and every one is a nightmare. For a while, it was 500 kilowatt net metering projects. When I have to tell people the process involved in going to the PUC, I feel like I'm leading lambs to slaughter. We have got to find a better way to site renewable energy in a way that we work together rather than fight. And I feel like your recommendations can go a long way in setting that framing when it comes to the legislature. So thank you for allowing me the time to offer my comment.
Thanks, Annette. Appreciate that. Steve?
Hi, thanks very much. I appreciate everything you've done. There's a lot of great ideas here. I want to support what Annette just said. That fits right in with one of the things that I'd like to bring up. Also, I also have concerns with regard to the cost discussion. I don't know how I would phrase that, but I think it's really important to place meeting our greenhouse goal reductions, meeting those goals as a priority right up there with cost. However that is managed, whether it's directly through one sector or another, or even outside of the sector through public support of some other kind. But I'd like to make a couple of specific suggestions here. One thing was Annette referred to, that we have the new res, and in some ways, theoretically that solves our need in the electricity sector, but it raises some questions about how we're going to get there. If we're going to get to 20% in-state renewables, then that means a whole lot more in-state renewables than we have right now, whether it's, 5, 6, 7 times as much as we have right now. So a couple of things that come to my mind is one, wherever possible, wherever appropriate, the goals of the new res should be incorporated into things like IRPs and other considerations, other elements of planning for Vermont. They should be part of the permit considerations. So it may well be that utilities are already thinking about how to do that, and maybe they've got it handled, but I don't think it hurts to have it be, it seems to be entirely consistent to do that. Same token, we have Act 174 energy planning, and that's based on greenhouse gas reduction goals, but now we have something more specific and more tangible to go on, which is that 20% res number over a period of time. Why shouldn't that be built into the planning guidelines just as much as the greenhouse gas reduction? Some anecdotal evidence that I've heard is that it is Act 174 has not turned into a pathway to yes. Let's just put it that way. It's created as many obstacles as it has opportunities, and it really ought to. I mean, we need those opportunities to be created. So, to me, it seems like not wholesale all at once, but as plans come due for revision and 6-year updates or whatever they're doing, that should be part of that picture. So another point I'd like to
just
bring
quickly,
up,
Steve, I don't want to interrupt for too long, but if you could wrap it up, we have one more.
I'll be really quick here.
Yep.
The one other thing that I want to bring up is that something like 2/3 of all Vermonters don't have access to solar energy, and many would like it. We hear about this all the time, and I hear it all the time from people, and they would like to figure out how to have access, even if they can't do it in their rental, or they've got too much shade, or the house is built wrong. So we need to find some pathway to replace the net metered offsite community solar that was lost in the revision of the res. Somehow, so that's my last point, I guess. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate those points. I have another hand. I just want to see, it's D. Jean Kraus. If you want to jump in.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Couple very quick comments. One, you were talking about the cost, raising the prices of electricity. I would note that the legislature recently passed a ratepayer protection plan proposal that might that has the potential of reducing the costs for those whose household income does not exceed a certain threshold, so that raising the prices of electricity is not necessarily going to harm those at the least able to pay. We're using more electricity. I would expect to pay more. The second thing is that I'm concerned when I hear statements like that we have made it with the electricity, or succeeded with the electricity in meeting significant goals. Hydro-Quebec is not in state, and our desire to have in-state generation is not met by Hydro-Quebec. Large hydro is not greenhouse gas free. There is methane both at the creation of the reservoir and in the ups and downs of the reservoir. Those reservoirs are typically on indigenous people's land who have been displaced. Forests have been removed from their sequestration, and mercury has been found in those waters as well. Now, those are all out-of-state concerns, but it is, in my opinion, not appropriate for us to claim advantages in meeting our climate goals while doing that at the expense of others who have no say in what we do here in Vermont. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Appreciate those comments. All right. I'm not seeing other hands. TJ?
Yeah, thanks, David. I just think it's appropriate when the public has spent the time listening to us and commenting that it's worthwhile to respond where appropriate. And so, and I know I'm not a counselor or on the committee anymore, but I'm on the electricity task force now. So I'll take the lead here. As far as Steve's comments go, I just want to point out that the new renewable energy standard is already showing up in integrated resource plans, ones that have been filed recently or even predicting what might happen have considered the new res as a planning scenario before it was passed, and then actually starting to plan for it. And so that is there. And we also do have 30 VSA 218C requires least cost planning, and that includes environmental concerns. And so, when you usually, and what we are pushing the utilities to do as the department with our IRP guidance is to review scenarios with from both a ratepayer perspective and a societal perspective using the social cost of carbon. There was a comment earlier on in the discussion about not believing that was real. I think so, maybe that's true for some people, but as far as the state is concerned, if that was directed at us, it's just evaluating both perspectives and then making a reasoned judgment using the information available from both perspectives. In terms of replacement for group net metering, there will be, the Public Service Department has the responsibility to issue a report on potential replacements for group net metering. That is, I believe that will be sent around to stakeholders tomorrow, if not today, and publicly. If we can get it up to on our website and press release out, it'll be tomorrow. It might be Monday for wider distribution. And that'll be a draft that's available for comment. So, and the final report is due in January. And finally, Mr. Kraus, I just want to, I think all of the issues you raise are important issues. I think when, the comment of we are there in terms of this committee is the cross-sector mitigation committee is concerned about mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions as they are counted by the greenhouse gas inventory pursuant to the Global Warming Solutions Act. And in that respect, the 100% carbon-free as counted in the way the GWSA says has like a path of, for mitigation purposes by the way we count, that I think that comment, at least as I was thinking of it, was related to that. I think those other issues that you bring up are important issues to keep talking about it. I don't know how core it is to the scope of this committee, and so I just want to acknowledge that we hear that and explain where that was coming from, at least when I said it.
Thanks, TJ. Helpful clarifications. Are there other reflections folks have about the comments that were made? TJ, there's a specific question in the chat too about that report, if you want to answer that, and you can do it in chat or otherwise.
Yeah, I can respond here. We've taken the approach that it's that the ask is broader, the plain language of the bill, even though lots of stakeholders only wanted it focused on affordable housing. The Public Service Department has read that language to be more broad. So we will be proposing, or we're proposing replacements with a focus on affordable housing, but more broad solutions.
Great. Okay. All right. So I think I'd like to do two things. One is I'd like to really think about our next steps and be realistic about what needs to happen over the next 5 to 7 days. So that's one thing I'd like to do. The other thing, I'd imagine looking across all three areas and using that PowerPoint I've been showing to do that. I didn't really fill out the PowerPoint. I'm doing it right now, but I thought it might be helpful just to remind ourselves what's here. And I mean, let's open it up just for a second and just have any final reflections looking at this. And so if we think about everything we talked about today across all three of these, we talked about these buildings and thermal for key recommendations, the priority actions. We talked about these three, transportation, maybe a fourth, or maybe this is just a framing for the rest of it. Not quite sure if it rises to the level of specificity of a priority action. So not totally sure about that. Maybe that's something that the transportation group could sit on and figure out if they want to do something there or not. But these three core ones. And then electricity, was probably some there on something around demand management and costs, and something about access and what we want to say in terms of some priority actions and who those should be directed towards and the level of specificity there. I'm just curious, when you look across these three, how are you feeling about these as things you want to shine very bright lights on, right? You're going to have the full package go and be part of the climate action plan too, but this is where you're shining the brightest light, where you're putting the most attention, and you're trying to really raise the profile of these things. I'm just curious if when you look at them across like this, how does it feel? Are you comfortable? Is there something else that's like screaming and that's not in there that you really think really should be coming from the rest of your work? I'm curious, just have that reflection. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
You know, it feels, oh, sorry, Rich. Go
No,
ahead.
Bram, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bram.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, if we as a state accomplish the things on this list, you know, the electricity list is shy of the things that were in their presentation, but you know, if we accomplish these, that'll be a huge accomplishment, and I think we'll, you know, these are the big important things that will make the most difference in reducing our emissions and moving us to a clean energy future. I think this is a good set of top priorities to be top priorities.
Thanks, Bram. And Rich, go ahead. And then after Rich, you know, I'm going to ask some of the subcommittee members that haven't spoken up as much today to chime in. So be prepared, subcommittee members. I may even call on you. So just heads up, full warning. I'm interested to hear a variety of views, particularly folks who haven't chimed in as much today. But Rich, go ahead, please.
Okay, I'll be quick. I agree completely with what Bram said. And I would, although, make two other points. The word access that you just wrote, David, I think it's more than access. I mean, it's really enabling Vermonters to participate in the transition and access. Yeah. So, and I think the electric group will be able to work on those two bullets and get back to the full committee. And the substantive point I want to make, you asked the question, like, what's not here? And the big thing that's not here, other than the financial implications of policies that are here, which are substantial, which, funding for good things will happen with a modified clean heat standard or with a cap and invest strategy, for example. So there are funding pathways embedded in some of our recommendations, but we haven't taken a cross-cutting view of the funding and financing question, particularly long-term investments and how to pay for them when we know that a lot of the actions that we're calling for are investments. Weatherization, heat pumps, electric vehicles. These are investments that involve a timing differential between when you pay for them and when you get the benefits. And we haven't, as a council, I think, actually identified how we would address that problem other than by saying, well, in a cap and invest program or in a performance of, a broad performance mechanism like clean heat standard, it's embedded. And I'm answering your question, what's missing? I don't know that we're going to get to it, but that is a cross-cutting issue, and it probably goes across all the committees.
Yeah. I think one thing to think about there is maybe some guidance around it rather than, naming the funding source or the funding mechanisms. Probably more about guidance, about criteria and stuff like that is my guess of what you could get to. Okay. Thanks, Rich. Appreciate that reflection. Others, particularly if you haven't really chimed in much today and you're sort of sitting with this and wondering how you want to react to it, now's a great time to jump in. I see a handful of subcommittee members here, whether it's Matt or Eric or some others, I'd welcome if you want to jump in, if you have some thoughts about this. Brian?
I'll be quick because I want to hear from those folks as well. I missed most of the buildings thermal because I was on a Reggie call. I think the work across states and multi-state and multi-jurisdictional programs, that's where my head is at, and that's a lot of work that I do. I think that applies to both the thermal and transportation areas, and certainly Climate Action Office is going to continue to work to identify opportunities to be able to advance in a multi-jurisdictional way for all the good reasons that there is to do that. We already do it very effectively in electricity, as Rich regularly points out, which is great. And I think there's great opportunities to be able to do that in these other sectors as well.
Yeah, and may even, I think I've heard you talk as well, Brian, about in the past about maybe the reason that they would succeed, right? Like if we have standards and things like that, very hard sometimes to do that as a state alone.
Yeah, shared administrative costs, more effective and cost-effective and effective pathways for compliance. Yeah, all good reasons. There's, it's complicated, when you're working with friends, but it has great benefits when we work together.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that. Okay. Other reflections, particularly folks, if you haven't jumped in as much today, subcommittee members would welcome you to jump in now. Joey?
I'm happy to defer to others, but just one question about the electric sector, 2 little bullets here. I can't remember what the third bullet that Liz, or the third pathway that Liz had elevated to potentially recommend as one full pathway, but I think it went beyond demand management and costs. And I'm just thinking about it in terms of the transportation work and the work with the electric sector and the distribution utilities on the EVSC and other things. So it feels like that little bullet that you've captured here, David, may not be sufficient to.
Okay.
And what I would hope so maybe wanting to look back at the pathway 3, what Liz had recommended as pathway 1, to maybe reflect a little bit more beyond just demand management to a reverberation with the transportation sector efforts, clearly thermal too, but I mean, I think it was more broad and captured more broadly, and I would hope we might still capture that more broadly.
Okay. I'd welcome thoughts on that. My understanding, what is pathway 3 and what was presented now from electricity was about load management, grid optimization, and with the associated cost benefits of that.
Okay, I can't remember. It seemed a little bit more broad, and so if it was, I'd want that to be captured.
Yeah, I hear you, Joey, and I had taken David's notes as just notes. I do think our task group, it sounds like we need to get that captured and considered and then around to all of you. And grid optimization and, encompasses system improvements in a way that demand management doesn't on its own.
Okay, thanks. With your thinking around the EVSC and other electrification would be great. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Joey. Appreciate that. Melissa?
Sure, I'll be quick too, because I know I've spoken a lot. I just wanted to note that for buildings and thermal, I think we probably do have some reconsideration we need to do around the equipment standard. At our last meeting, the potential other priority that could have been lifted up was around ensuring beneficial electrification and access for all. So I just want to note that, I think there are some reservations around the equipment standards, both in light of the comments Annette made earlier and what we heard in our thermal sector public meeting, where we did hear some concerns from the weatherization assistance providers, as well as affordable housing providers and really important stakeholders. So I think it's just something we need to look at a little bit more closely in light of what are the GHG reductions we can get there and what are the impacts. And I understand Jared's really been clear that we can build in exclusions to such a standard, but essentially if you water down a standard too much, you risk not really having a meaningful standard that achieves GHG reduction. So that's just one takeaway, I think, for buildings and thermal.
And Melissa, could I get you to go one more step on that to say, if you're giving specific guidance to a new, like an updated version of that PowerPoint from buildings and thermal, like what is it you'd like to see in there that's different than what's in it right now?
Well, we had a conversation that I think was unsettled at buildings and thermal, whether that actually should be one of our priority actions. It will undoubtedly be one of the recommendations in the overall list, but is this the priority we want to flag? Or are there enough concerns with that policy that we should raise up a different priority, which was around essentially incentivizing electrification for households?
Okay, can we take a moment right now and talk about that? Because I'd be interested, subcommittee members, when you hear Melissa say that, do some of you share her concerns that maybe this isn't the right approach to have an equipment performance standard? There might be a better approach. Given some of the feedback we've gotten in this meeting and in other public meetings. Do folks share her concerns? Dave?
I think we need to have the discussion. What I heard from Sam today and what I mentioned to her in an email when I sent out our PowerPoint also is of concern to me. We're talking about equity and access. We all nod. We try to build it into everything we do, all these different policies, but it doesn't get explicit treatment. And affordability and access are really going to be critical. Keeping down costs and avoiding and being very parsimonious about imposing new costs, being very careful about that. Those are things we need to discuss. So I agree with Melissa's point. I'm kind of thinking it might be a little bit bigger. So I look forward to discussing it.
Okay. Again, no time like the present to discuss it. guess is my point.
Well, I propose sometimes Monday and Tuesday to discuss it, because I think everybody's, you too, David, you got to be exhausted. You've been at this for 6 hours today, right?
Yes. It's okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Jared?
Thanks. Yeah, I am happy to go back and continue having conversations in the thermal task group about these recommendations. I will say that I continue to think it's very important that well-designed, phased in with appropriate exemptions, equipment-based performance standard is important for 3 key reasons that we have talked about today. One is we talk about our emissions reduction obligations. The longer that we allow polluting equipment to be newly installed that will exist for 20 years, it becomes pretty quickly mathematically impossible to meet our greenhouse gas reduction obligations because we've locked in that much fossil fuel dependent equipment, which I believe is inappropriate when there are zero emissions, cost-effective alternatives that are available instead. That is not the case across the board, and so there does need to be nuance in terms of how a performance standard would be designed and applied. The other reason is explicitly because of a concern about costs and equity. Over time, the highest cost, most price volatile way for Vermonters to heat their homes tend to be with fuel oil and propane. So we want, from a consumer protection perspective, to avoid lock-in of high-cost equipment when there is equipment that over time will save people money in addition to reducing pollution. And the third reason is because of our stated desire to collaborate regionally and learn from other states. There are model rules being advanced around equipment-based performance standards in other states right now. And so to not seize that opportunity to learn from and with them, to responsibly, carefully design these for a phased-in approach with exemptions so that we don't enable that lock-in of high-polluting, high-cost equipment farther into the future than we can afford either to meet our climate pollution reduction targets or than Vermonters' budgets can afford. I think it would be a major missed opportunity not to focus on that.
Okay. Thanks, Jared. Brian?
Yeah, so the Climate Action Office is actively engaged in that regional conversation regarding appliance standards. I think then the context is that there is this model rule. Maryland is going to move ahead with adopting a model rule for heating appliances and for water heaters. It's going to be effective 2029 or 2030, and it goes in line with the comment that I made before. Adopting this kind of a performance standard, regionally with neighboring states is going to be much more effective, and it's going to be on that time frame. So this just for that's one of the things that the group is going to consider in the context of what Melissa said. This isn't unimportant, but is it the most important? And is it timely here to elevate understanding that these conversations are going to consider, and there's always the opportunity to move ahead on a schedule that works better for us and gets us more results. Is there another strategy that's more is going to advance our potential achievement of the 2030 requirement than this one?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah. Ben, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, and we'll be discussing this more next week, but just wanted to throw out there that where my mind goes, and I think others too, is the points that Brian just made. I think it's those are great points with the regionally more effective strategies, but also I think about the equity concerns, and just thinking about looking regionally at some of the recent studies that have come out. For example, from Maine, Efficiency Maine just came out with a study of the effectiveness of heat pumps. I think it's important to think about kind of what we'd be replacing these units with, and then, the cost associated with that. Yeah, so there's a lot to it, but I think there may be opportunity for more gains in in more of a beneficial electrification scenario. Because, yeah, we know right now that a lot of the options that would be replacing the existing units would be quite costly. So without substantial, incentive offered to them to use those units for more of a central system, the ductless systems, I don't think would be an appropriate replacement in many cases. So it's very nuanced. But we can have a more in-depth discussion next week. But I do like that we do have some language in there about exceptions, but then as others have mentioned, it does get it's kind of a slippery slope. How much do you dwindle those GHG reduction potential down by if you keep exempting larger swaths of the population? So yeah, more to be said later, but those are my quick reactions.
Thanks, Ben. Okay. All right. So it sounds like there's some conversation needs to happen next week. I think that's a good pivot to our next steps, because unless there's something else folks want to say on this, looking across all these issues.
David, I was just going to really quickly point out that and I might be wrong, but I heard Melissa say that we just might not prioritize this one versus entirely rethink. So I just want to be clear that I feel like we then really got into the discussion about it just now in the comments, but I think what I heard was it was more so that we might then lift up the other strategy we were considering to prioritize in this list of 4. So just to be clear.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could include it, but it's not one of your top 4 or top 5. Yeah, from the task group. Okay. Those are options for you all to discuss. Okay. All right. So should we talk about next steps? So help me out here. You all meet next Thursday, have a normal 2-hour meeting, something like that. Is that right?
That's right. We're scheduled 12 to 2 a week from today.
Okay. And to back ourselves up from that, one of the things that would be really important for you, so that you have some confidence in the full package of things you're going to send up the very next day to the council, right? And you'll send the full package of the Excel files with pathway strategies and actions, consolidated from the 3 task groups, and your priorities, right? Those priority actions. To have confidence with that, you want to be able to sit a few days ahead of time and literally look through them, which we didn't do today, right? We didn't go through the full Excel files with all the strategies, pathway strategies and actions. That's in addition to nailing down these last pieces of priority action decisions, right? The one we just talked about and the 2 over in electricity. So I guess my feeling is by Tuesday afternoon at the latest, you should be sending amongst yourselves those full things. So you have Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and at the very latest Thursday morning to read those over. And you come to that meeting ready to flag things that are going to give you enormous heartburn, even if they're just in the big chunk of all the pathway strategies and actions. All right. That means that for task groups that want to come back together and react to this feedback, you're going to need to do that and have an output from it Monday-ish, right? Or Tuesday morning or something like that. So I just want to check with all task groups that feels like realistic, and you'll be able to do that, so that it's not, because I think it would be a tragedy to come and 5 minutes before drop the full Excel file or something, because you won't have time in your meeting on Thursday to look through each of those items. So quick reactions to that. Does that seem reasonable that Monday and by Tuesday morning, you're really locking in that content, and you're sending out an email to everybody by Tuesday afternoon?
I mean, are there other options?
I don't think so. I mean, I think you could beg for forgiveness to the council, but I mean, it doesn't seem like the best of options.
That that sounds right, David. And
Okay.
I think we're all trying to do that. I guess I have a question. Are the other committees, to your awareness, on a similar time frame? Are they going to be ready?
Everybody's pushing just like this. And I think we're gonna be doing this, right? Where everybody next week is gonna do final review, have some time to read, gather final sign off by the end of the week. That's what we're aiming for. I don't have visibility right now.
Clarify on that, our deliverables to the council are like Friday the 13th, whole package goes to the council, and then Monday the 16th are Rich and I on the hook for presenting.
Yep. With an emphasis, like, you know how buildings presented today, it's that template, right? So buildings and thermal went through each of their pathways. It was like, yeah, we got 6 strategies here, 2 actions, whatever, right? And by the way, here's our priority actions. And that's how you end the presentation. So you would go through and walk through probably each of your pathways, the number of strategies and actions, but you wouldn't really talk about that content. And then you would spend a little bit more time talking about that handful of priority actions that we just looked at on the screen. And it's going to be fast and furious because on Monday, the 16th, the council not only is listening to 3 subcommittees, there's 3 cross-cutting groups that will be presenting. So the land use folks, the workforce folks, and the education and outreach folks. So it's going to be like a complete data dump of information.
Do you have an estimate of the time of it that will be available for this committee's report?
Yeah, I think, just give me 1 second. I just had the agenda up. But let's say it's like a 10-minute presentation and a 15-minute conversation kind of thing. That's the range. Joey?
I mean, Rich has brought it up several times. I think it's very important. Is the financing, not just the funding, but the financing, where is that conversation showing up?
So if we think back to the first the initial climate action plan, I can't remember, like, was there a little final section that talked about funding and financing? I honestly can't remember.
I mean, I'm thinking about like who's rolling up their sleeves and looking at some of the things that other states are looking at, and like the Green Bank, and then there's the Treasurer's Climate Finance Initiative. And I mean, again, some of this is in flux considering. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I don't think even in the last cap, it was like clearly explored. And I know we're talking a lot about funding, but I think we also need to be thinking about financing. So I just don't know where that's showing up, and maybe you don't know, but maybe that's a question for the council, and or maybe we lean on the treasurer, but it just seems to me an important complement, because yeah.
And that is something that the council also can wrestle with if it really cuts across everything. So that could be something there, like the council's like, all right, we need to do a little bit of work on this in January and February.
Okay, well, I'd just love to flag it, because yeah, we all care about affordability. There is only so much capacity. We got to do what we need to do, but I think we need to make sure we're exhausting the financing strategies too.
Excellent. I just put in the notes from today, and so I will tidy up my notes, not to the point of them being pretty minutes, but I'm going to just tidy up my notes and send them around to all of you so you can have them in your task group conversations. Don't treat them as like formal minutes, because they're not going to be pretty and nice, but they'll have the content. It'll take me a little bit of time tonight to just tidy them up, and then I'll send them around.
So Joey, just for my benefit, how are you looking at the difference, like the definition between funding and financing?
Funding is paying for these things whole, right? Like it's a grant compared to like something like on-bill finance, something where people actually continue to pay, but pay monthly as opposed to fronting the entire investment for a cold climate heat pump of $5,000 that they're paying for that over time.
Okay, so revenue sources from things like a cap and invest is funding versus it's like a bond would be financing.
Yes, or on-bill financing. Again, I'm sorry, we continue to look to the electric sector, but like just sort of this, are there strategies out there that enable people who are paying monthly bills now to continue to pay monthly bills, but as opposed to just paying for their fuel oil to be delivered, and paying for that, they are amortizing it over time. Things like that are upfront costs, like solar and heat pumps and cold climate heat pumps.
Okay, great, thanks.
And Brian, just to go one more step, you could use something like a cap and invest revenue to fund a financing mechanism that could perhaps expand what you can deliver in the first 5 years from the same amount of money. So
yeah, no, I was thinking that like a revolving fund. Yeah, I get it. I didn't want to extend the conversation. I just wanted to make sure I understood exactly what the difference was in this context. So thanks, Joe.
Super. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay. All right. I think we're kind of there. I guess co-chairs, are you comfortable with the plan ahead, which is all task groups figure out a way to meet sometime between now and Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, they're sending you a revised Excel template and some other way to present their priority actions. So we make a kind of hard deadline for everybody Tuesday. And the reason we do that is so that you all have time to read the extensive Excel files and the priority actions. And then Thursday we get together and we finalize the priority actions, and it's on everybody to lift up anything they're seeing inside the big packets that merits a conversation. And frankly, it would be great if you see it to flag it to the co-chairs, maybe even to me ahead of time to be like, you know what, we're going to need to have a conversation about X, Y, and Z. That would be really helpful. And that's what Thursday's about, is locking all that down. Does that sound okay, co-chairs?
yeah, I agree with that. Flagging it early, both to your, fellow committee members and to the co-chairs will help us to organize Thursday.
Yep, and we can get materials out end of day Tuesday. I agree, David, 100% that we need to give people time to review in advance to make good use of our time Thursday.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions about next steps and what's coming down the road? All right. Wow, we did it on Zoom. It would have been much more fun to be together. Sorry about that. Thanks everyone for this final push. It's a lot of work. I really appreciate everybody leaning into it like this. Have a great rest of your day. I think we're done here. Good luck with this final push. Expect some notes from me. I'll tidy them up this afternoon, and I'll get them out this evening.
Thank you, David. Thanks all.